Good morning, Francisco. Carolina here. We are having problems with Minister Hood link because she is in another waiting room, not in this. So maybe if you can check.
Okay. Thank you, Carolina. My colleagues she's linked in. What's her name? Do you know if it's Gloria Hood? Okay, my colleagues will search for her in the attendee list and promote her to panelist.
Okay, okay.
Don't worry. And actually with this, all of our guests are now online. But for the people that are already joining, I will wait just 1 or 2 minutes before starting the session. Okay, it's 3 hours Paris time, 10 hours Argentina time. We'll start and we'll do the opening of this virtual conference now. First of all, good morning or good evening to all participants of the Decarbonizing Transport in an Unprecedented Global Crisis conference. My name is Francisco Furtado. I will be your host for this first session of this virtual conference. Before presenting our distinguished guests and going into some of the contents of this series of webinars, of this virtual conference, I'll call your attention and I'll highlight a relevant feature of these sessions, is that UF interpretation is available. These sessions can be heard, can be listened to in English, in Spanish, and in some cases in Portuguese, which is the case of this session, but not all of them. If you noticed in the bottom of your screen or your Zoom app, there will be an icon with the world symbol. You can click on that icon and choose the language you want to listen to. A note I give about this is that we advise you not to mute the original audio, because this way, if you don't mute, you will be able to listen to your preferred language, to the channel you selected, all through the conference, irrespective if the speakers are speaking in English or in Spanish. Another relevant feature of these sessions that I want to call attention and highlight is that all of the sessions are being recorded, and all of these sessions will be available online in our webpage of the conference, and they will be available both in English with the English soundtrack and with the Spanish soundtrack. Also, when there are presentations, for instance, the presentation I'm just doing now, this will also be available on the website. Now, for some important background to this conference. The conference takes place, it's integrated into a wider project. It's called Decarbonizing Transport in Emerging Economies. It's a project that's been implemented by the International Transport Forum, the Wuppertal Institute, and it's financed by the International Climate Initiative, which is a part of the German Ministry of the Environment. This project takes place in 4 countries and their respective regions, namely Argentina, Azerbaijan, India, and Morocco. Of course, this conference, Decarbonizing Transport in an Unprecedented Global Crisis, is part of the Argentinian chapter of the project, and also as not just Argentinian, I would say, but the Latin American reach. For the project in Argentina, and specifically for this conference, I should also mention the cooperation, the very relevant cooperation of the Transport Ministry of Argentina and the Sustentar Association, which is part of the LEDSLAC platform. The conference starts today. It goes on until the 30th of July. We'll have in total 9 open sessions. The sessions always start at the same time, 3 hours Central European time, 3 hours PM Central European time, 10 hours Buenos Aires time. Today, it will be a bit special because today we have a double session. We start with the introduction and welcome, but then after a short break, a short 10 minutes break, we will have the next session, panel with discussion on decarbonization, economic recovery, and resilience. And I highlight that transport decarbonization, while attending to the needs of economic recovery and the resilience of the transport systems, it's the overall theme of this conference and the series of webinars that we will be doing along the month of July. So moving now to the introduction and welcome itself. The first thing, I have to highlight the list of distinguished guests that honor us with their presence today at this session. I have to mention Minister of Transport of Argentina, Mario Meoni, Minister of Transport and Telecommunications of Chile, Gloria Hutt, the Director General of the Federal Ministry of the Environment from Germany, Carsten Sach, and Yang Tae Kim, Secretary General of the International Transport Forum. With us, we will also have additional speakers in this introduction session from the organizations that are cooperating to make possible this conference. And I myself, I'm Francisco Furtado, I'm your host. I'm the lead of the Decarbonizing Transport in Emerging Economies project, and I work in the International Transport Forum as an analyst and a modeler. But without further delays, I present to you Yang Tae Kim, is Secretary General of the International Transport Forum. And Yang Tae, the floor is yours. I give you the floor for the opening speech of this session and the conference.
Thank you, Francisco. Buenos días a todos. Me permitiré decir algunas palabras en español.
Good morning. I will say a few
Es un
words
honor
in
para mí
Spanish.
darles la
It is an
bienvenida
honor
como
to welcome
Secretario
you
General de Foro
as Secretary
Internacional de
General
Transportes
of
a
the
esta
International
serie de
Transport Forum
conferencias
to the
virtuales
series
que
of
nos
virtual
reunirán a lo largo
conferences
del
that
mes de
will
julio.
bring us together throughout the
Antes
month
que
of
nada,
July.
y para
Above
quienes no lo
all,
conocen,
and for those of you who are not
permítanme hablar un
familiar
poco
with
sobre
it,
el Foro
allow
Internacional
me
de
to
Transportes, o
talk to
FIT.
you about the ITF. ITF.
El FIT es una organización
The ITF is an
intergubernamental con 60
intergovernmental
países miembros.
organization with 60
Entre ellos,
member countries,
13 encuentran en
including
América Latina,
13 that are
Argentina,
located in
Chile
Latin
y
America,
México.
Argentina,
La
Chile,
organización
and
tiene
Mexico included.
autonomía
The
política
organization
y
has
está
political autonomy
administrativamente
and
ligada
is,
a la
from an
OCDE.
administrative perspective,
El objetivo de
associated
FIT
to
es
the
promover un
OECD.
mejor
The
diálogo para
purpose
un mejor
of this
transporte.
association is to promote
Busca
dialogue and
incrementar
improve
la
transportation
importancia de
and
las
seeks to
políticas de
increase the
transporte
importance
en la
of
agenda
transportation
pública
policies
y
in the public
promover el
agenda, as well
diálogo
as
entre
promoting
todos los
dialogue
actores
among
pertinentes
all the
para este fin.
stakeholders
En este
in
marco,
this
es la
topic.
única
Within this
organización
framework, it is the
internacional que
only
se
international
concentra en todos los
organization
modos de
that
transporte.
focuses on all modes of
También busca
transport.
apoyar a sus
It
países
also
miembros
seeks to
en el
support its
análisis
member
de sus
countries in
políticas públicas de
analyzing public
transporte.
policies
Todas
regarding
sus
transportation.
actividades están
All of its
basadas en
activities are
rigurosa
based on
investigación cuantitativa y
very
cualitativa.
thorough quantitative and
El FIT
qualitative
organiza
research.
anualmente
The
la Cumbre de
ITF
Transporte.
organizes an annual
Es el
summit,
principal evento de
which is
política
the
global de
main
transporte
event
que
focused on
reúne a
global transport
ministros,
policies
jefes de
and which gathers
organizaciones
ministers,
internacionales,
heads of international
líderes de opinión al
organizations,
más alto nivel.
opinion leaders of the highest
Debido a la
level as
crisis
well.
del
Due to the
COVID-19, los
COVID-19
países miembros
crisis,
de FIT
the
han
member
decidido
countries of the
excepcionalmente
ITF have
postergar
decided
la cumbre de
to
transportes
exceptionally
del
postpone this
2020.
summit that was
Esperamos poder
expected
anunciar la
to
nueva
take place
fecha
in
de la
2020.
siguiente cumbre
We hope we are able
próximamente
to
con
announce
previo
the next
acuerdo
date
de
of the
nuestros
summit
países miembros.
with prior agreement, of course,
Nuestro
of all our
trabajo
member countries.
riguroso de
Our
investigación y
rigorous
promoción
work
del
that
diálogo
focuses on research
igualmente
and
se ve
dialogue
reflejado en
promotion
esta conferencia que nos
is,
reúne
of
hoy.
course, reflected in this
Me gustaría
conference
en este
that
momento
brings us together today.
agradecer de
I
manera
would like to
especial la
thank
presencia de las
today,
autoridades
especially the
que me
presence of all
acompañan
the
a
authorities that
inaugurar
are
este
joining
evento.
us today
Es un
in
honor
this official
contar con
opening.
ustedes.
It is an honor to have you here
Ministros
today.
Mario Meoni,
Minister Mario
es un
Meoni,
placer poder
it is a
conocerle
pleasure
finalmente
to be able to
y tener
finally
este
meet you
espacio común.
and have this
Le
common
agradezco por la
space for
confianza en
discussion. I would
nuestra
like to thank you
organización para
for
la
your continued
coordinación de
trust
este
in our
evento y
organization
espero que
and for
nuestra
helping us
relación con su
make this
gestión
event
en
a
el
reality.
ministerio
Also, I
pueda
would like to thank
seguir
you for your
siendo
work in the ministry,
fructífera en el
and I
futuro.
hope that it will continue to be fruitful in the
Ministra Gloria
future.
Hood S. Me complace
I would
ver a
also
una
like to
amiga de
thank
FIT
Minister Gloria
y
Hutt
volver a
as a friend
compartir un
of
espacio
the
con usted
ITF.
en el
I am
marco de
very happy to
nuestras
be sharing this
actividades.
space with you today again within the
Durante
framework
su
of our
gestión,
activities.
ha sido una de
During
nuestras
your work
principales
at the
aliadas
ministry, you have been
en
one of our
promover la
main allies in
descarbonización de
promoting
transportes en América Latina,
decarbonization of transport in
acompañada
Latin
de un
America,
desarrollo
together
sostenible para
with
la región a
sustainable
nivel social y
development for
económico.
the region and
Es
for
grato ver que esto
social and
sigue siendo
economic
el caso.
development as well.
Now a little bit in English. Director General Carsten Sash, I'm pleased and thankful to be able to share this floor with you. The MU's initiative has been crucial for the development of ITF's Decarbonising Transport initiative. This series of conferences, as well as the wider DTE project, bear testimony to that. Please also convey my best regards to State Secretary Flassberg. De vuelta en español, igualmente doy las gracias a todos los
Back
colegas
to Spanish,
expertos
I would like
y
to thank
funcionarios
all of my
públicos
expert
quienes nos
colleagues and
acompañarán y
public
compartirán sus
experts as
ideas con
well who have
nosotros a
shared
lo
their
largo de
ideas
las
with
próximas
us
semanas.
throughout and will
Esta
share their
serie de
ideas throughout the
conferencias
next
tiene
weeks.
vocación
This
global
series of
y se
conferences have
centra
a
en
global
Argentina.
focus and
Desde
is
que Argentina
centered
se unió
on
al FIT en
Argentina. Since
2015,
Argentina joined the
hemos
ITF in
trabajado de la
2015,
mano con
we have
autoridades
worked ever since
nacionales
with the
para que
national
el sector
authorities
transporte
so that the
participe en
transportation
el
sector can
desarrollo sostenible
participate
del
in
país.
the sustainable
A nivel
development of the
social,
country. At a
hemos
social
trabajado
level,
arduamente
we
para
have worked
promover la
hard
seguridad
to
vial en
promote
ciudades argentinas.
roadway
A nivel
security in
económico,
the cities of
en el
Argentina. From an
2018
economic perspective, in
hicimos una investigación
2018,
que buscaba
we carried
responder a
out
los
a research
desafíos para la
to
competitividad
address the
económica
challenges
del
regarding
puerto de Buenos Aires,
competitiveness
principal puerto
and
de
other issues in the
contenedores del
port of
país.
Buenos Aires, especially
A
container
nivel
ports throughout the
medioambiental,
country. From an
desde el
environmental perspective,
2019
since
llevamos dos proyectos
2019,
clave.
We have
de
carried
este
out
es
2 key
el motivo
projects.
que nos trae hoy aquí,
DTEE is one of
y
them,
descarbonización de
and is
transportes
the
en las
reason we are
ciudades
gathered here
latinoamericanas.
today,
Buenos
that
Aires es
studies
uno
the
de los protagonistas
decarbonization
de
of
este
transport
segundo
in this
proyecto que
region.
llevamos de la mano con el
We have
PIB.
developed this project
La
together
serie de
with the
conferencias que
PIB.
empieza hoy
A series
se
of
marca
conferences
en
that
esta
start
voluntad de
today are
apoyar a
within
las
the framework
autoridades
of
argentinas
this
en la
desire to
reducción de
support
las
the
emisiones de
Argentine
CO2
authorities
en el
in
sector
reducing
transporte,
CO2
de
emissions in
mano
the
con
transport
otras
sector,
prioridades de
together with
política
other
pública.
priorities regarding
El
public
título de la serie de
policies.
conferencias
The title
hace
of the
llamado a
series of
una realidad.
conferences
El
is related
COVID-19
to the
ha traído una
reality of
nueva crisis
COVID-19,
global
which has brought
sin
about a
precedentes
global
y de un
crisis
tamaño
which
que
is
no
of
hemos
an
conocido en un
unprecedented
siglo.
nature.
Esta crisis conlleva nuevos
This crisis
desafíos y
entails
genera
new
nuevas
challenges
necesidades sanitarias,
and creates
económicas y
new
sociales
health-related
para nuestros
needs and
países.
also economic and social needs for
Descarbonizar
our
el transporte
countries.
en este contexto
Decarbonizing
es
transport
un
within
reto
this
que debemos
context is
asumir
a
a fin de
challenge that we
cumplir con
must
los
face in
compromisos
order to fulfill
medioambientales del
the
planeta.
commitments
Espero que
related to
las
the environment
discusiones de
in our
estas
planet.
próximas
I
semanas
hope that the
sean terreno
discussions in the
fértil
next few weeks
para
will be
futuras
fertile
soluciones y
background for
acciones
future
que nos
solutions and
acerquen más a
actions
una
that will
movilidad
bring us
realmente
closer
sostenible.
to a
Muchas
truly
gracias.
sustainable mobility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yang Tae Kim, Secretary General of the ITF, for your words. Thank you for presenting to many of the people in the attendance that don't know what the ITF is, to give them a brief presentation, highlighting the work that has been going on in Argentina, and also highlighting the topic and the challenges that we face nowadays, and this issue of the need to decarbonize transport, address climate change, but at the same time, not ignoring the challenges and the economic challenges and social challenges that we face as a consequence of the pandemic of COVID-19. But now, without further ado, I will move to our next distinguished speaker. He's the Director General of International and European Policy, Climate Policy at the Federal Ministry for the Environment in Germany, Carsten Sach. He represents here, I should say this is important, he represents here the project, the Decarbonizing Transport in Emerging Economies project funders. Without them, this conference and this overall work that we are doing would have not been possible. So good evening, Carsten Sach. We're very glad to have you with us today, and I give you the floor, please.
Thank you, Francisco, for this kind introduction. Honorable Minister Meoni, Honorable Minister Hutt, dear Secretary General Yang Tae Kim, dear speakers, colleagues, friends, thank you for having me. And as you said, in my department, I'm also responsible to finance climate change policies internationally through our program International Climate Initiative. And one project we're running is, or supporting, is transport decarbonization in times of unprecedented global crises. And therefore, I'm very happy to supporting your excellent work here. We all know, and the Secretary General has made that very clear, that the current corona pandemic poses enormous challenges to all of us. People fear for their own health as well as of the lives of their families, and we are deprived of many things which got normal to us, and companies and people are fearing that their economic basis is eroding. At the same time, and that's why we are discussing here, we have another huge challenge, climate change, which is progressing. We see enormous events also this year. And therefore, it is a trivial conclusion that solutions to both challenges must go hand in hand. And we think that many of the issues we have planned for the next 10 years are just now happening in the next 6 to 18 months, because we are all discussing on how best to recover. And so we need to act swiftly and quickly. And the UN Secretary General says the motto is building back better, more inclusive, not just returning to the old normal that would have the consequence that we have missed a chance. And therefore, we should be working towards a green recovery worldwide. In Europe, the EU plans to update our ambition goal on our climate ambition until the end of 2020. And we are just in the midst of discussing economic recovery plan oriented towards the Green Deal. And that is another hat I'm wearing, the head of the EU presidency. And that is probably the big challenge and the wonderful task we are having. We in Germany, just 4 weeks ago, we approved key points of our own economic and future recovery package to deal with the economic consequences. And we are proud that out of this, a large portion has been devoted also to building a new transport infrastructure, but for green transformative purposes. And we are convinced that we will only thrive economically if we are able to emerge out of the crisis in a more climate-friendly and sustainable way. And that means that the transformation of the energy, the mobility, and the heat sector needs to be taken into account when designing our policies. The transport sector, and you are well aware of that, contributes approximately 1/4 of all energy-related carbon dioxide emissions, and therefore it is important to work towards just more climate-friendly modes of transport as well. And your forum just plays a major role in achieving that. Our ICI program, the International Climate Initiative, has quite an important and growing portfolio of sustainable mobility projects. Currently, we're funding it with an overall funding volume of close to 100 million euros. Exactly, it's 93.4 million euros, and that's allocated in 16 ongoing projects, and furthermore, 2 new projects are planned with a funding volume of 35 million projects. So transport, green transport, getting the infrastructure for transport right is a priority for us. And we know that there is not a solution which fits everybody, and we know that there are many aspects to be taken into account when designing recovery programs which fit countries. And that's why we have launched, together with the World Resources Institute and other international organizations and leading think tanks, an international dialogue process to develop potential approaches in thematic areas such as resilience, energy, finance, biodiversity, but also transport. We will be developing together with WRI a final report based on institutional expertise, which we would like to share and discuss with other fora and with countries. Within the NDC partnership, we and UN Alliance PAGE, the Partnership for Action on Green Recovery, we will financially support economic advisors on green recovery to partner countries. So to come to the end, I think it is important that we link up the different initiatives, including the ones you are undertaking with a focus in Argentina, learn from each other, and therefore being able to upscaling and adjusting our course. And we are very pleased, as I said in the beginning, that we are able to funding these activities. We wish you all the best for your project. We are proud funders, and that's why I'm here today. Good luck and good success in moving us forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General, for your kind words and for your wishes of good luck. I would highlight some of the words you said, and that this is a moment to act swiftly. And I think there was actually a philosopher that once said, there are months where decades happen, while sometimes there's decades where nothing happens. And I think indeed we are living such a moment. And your words that we need to build back, but build back better with new transformative green transform, I think they give comfort to all in the transport community and that work in these projects, that indeed, despite the crisis, which is of course a terrible thing, there is also here an opportunity to build back better. But without further delay, I will move to our next distinguished guest, Minister Mario Meoni of Argentina. I must say that throughout this project, we started, our first meeting was last September, but throughout this project and different administrations, the Ministry of Transport of Argentina has been absolutely essential. They've always been our main partner. They have cooperated with us in this conference and in other tasks before that. I thank you for that. And I also thank you for honoring us with your presence today. But without further ado, Minister of Transport of Argentina, Mario Meoni, I give you the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Good morning. Very kind of you for allowing me the presentation. I would also like to thank the Secretary General, Mr. Kim, those of you who share with us, Mr. Haston, my colleague from Chile, Gloria Hatt, Francisco Maciel, each and every one of you who have committed themselves to work towards a more equitable team in environmental terms, because what we have seen through the pandemic today, there are some issues where borders and geopolitical borders are not enough. Clearly, environmental issues are not enough to be, it's not enough for us to develop national policies, but we have to develop a framework, international framework agreement, because we have to understand this also as a pandemic, international pandemic. In Argentina, we are in the face of a very complex situation, firstly because the COVID-19 is leading us to a virtual default with serious economic problems. We are coming from a very serious situation in economic terms from the last year, and much more in terms of environmental issues. In transport, there is a backward movement, and so we have to think truly that we started with the pandemic in a much more critical situation. However, it is also true, as Kim mentioned, that it's a new opportunity we have to stand and to move forward. This pandemic has also moved the impact of the carbon emissions. Throughout these 100 days of low activity in Argentina, the environmental impact has been amazing. We haven't seen carbon emissions as the one we have seen nowadays, which is a very low environmental impact. The challenges ahead are very many. As I said, transport in Argentina is based 100% on the conventional way, railways. As you said, as you know, we have a very broad railway network that is extraordinary, a high primary commodities freight transport, with a very important development, river and maritime transport, but not low enough to lower the impact of road freight transport that is especially used by trucks in the interior of the country, and also public transportation without long distance railways. With all this, in the face of this complex situation, we have to be very proactive in terms of new schemes of transport in Argentina that can bring about substantial changes. I would like to tell you where we are. We have 18,000 units of buses for urban transport, and the interior in the provinces, there are 14,000 in the main cities, especially public transport. We have 5,000 units of long-distance buses, about 38,000 public transport buses in Argentina. We have railway lines transporting 1.5 million passengers. Many railway lines are still diesel propelled. Freight transport is 90% with trucks. As I said, river and maritime, it's a low activity for freight transport. It is led by the Buenos Aires harbor, but air is related to international commerce. But there is a very high environmental impact in that sector. Prior COVID, we were focused on, along with the productive ministry, economy ministry, in the understanding that this calls for a holistic reconversion. Those who compete in transportation in this negative impact is the manufacturing industry that has a very high impact environmental issues. Then the agricultural industry brings about a lot of pollution. We are working along those action lines in railway, and firstly, we are focusing on a very important work in the northwestern area, which is the San Martin Railway in the northwestern of Buenos Aires. In the south, Belgrano Sur, starting to work on the rest of the missing railways, such as Roca urban transport, and the Urquiza and Belgrano Norte railway lines. But we understand that in the next 6-7 years, we should go into the total reconversion for electrical railway transportation. And this will bring about a very positive impact in terms of the environment and an improvement of the quality of transportation of the people who really care about. As to metro buses, it's a great concentration, 18,000 units for 20 million inhabitants. We are going to work on two aspects. First has to be the regulation, so as to change for electrical equipment, for example, and in between possibilities. Of course, the total reconversion to electrical units is the ideal one, but this is generated through input that is based on oil. Photovoltaic energy is of low development in Argentina, so that is not always a positive aspect. And we have another drawback. The purchase of units would mean 100% an import. So a high percentage of those make it really impossible, taking into account the context in Argentina and the cost of each unit. A conventional unit is about $150,000. A unit from abroad that is electrical is $450,000. So 3 times more. So there are many inconveniences, many problems. But we think there is an in-between possibility toward reconversion with electrical railway lines. And that's the use of DNC, not only for the transportation of passengers, but also freight. We have compressed natural gas, and that will allow us to go to an in-between period until we can fully develop the projects of electrical units in Argentina, a process that the Productive Ministry is developing with manufacturing industries in Argentina, understanding that lithium is a very important natural resource to purchase, to develop batteries, but that requires a type of investment that is very hefty and it's very complex. And we want to move forward and develop a program along those lines. We are also actively working towards the development of freight railway transport, and will bring a negative impact in the environment, in the low emissions, and we are developing new railway lines along the countries, rebuilding lines that will allow us to move towards that. Railway transportation increased 27% regarding the last semester, 39% with reference to the last month, and we are developing a very active policy to lower costs and with a positive impact in terms of carbon emissions. As you know, in a brief synthesis, we try to convey the aims and the goals we are working on. The pandemic has focused on the transportation of people. In Argentina, our president has focused on health, life, of course, later on, work, heritage, and the development on work on different areas. In environmental issues, we had an interministry meeting as to the commitments, environmental commitments for Argentina. We lead decisions in terms of having a cleaner economy, a greener transport, and we're going to be working on that on the next month. The next month, we should have the necessary regulations in place, although we are still working on the development of investment for the electrification of the railway lines. And we are going to move more holistically towards a 4-year process to change the fleet of transports in general, also in terms of policies for the transportation of passengers towards electrical units. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I took longer than I should, but I'm very pleased to be part of this interesting conference, and we hope we can meet soon again. Thank you very much.
Minister Mario Meone, I am the one that says thank you. Thank you for your speech. It was indeed a very broad overview, but where you indeed made a good summary of the several challenges facing the transport system and the initiatives that exist, or potential initiatives to decarbonize the transport system in Argentina. I think it was very useful as as a speech for all of our attendees to be aware of the situation, what is going there in Argentina, what measures are being planned, what is going on, and you also said several important things, but there are no borders for the pandemic. There's no borders for climate change problems. So sharing experiences, sharing knowledge is absolutely fundamental for us, all of us, to overcome these problems. And talking about borders and sharing, we'll go to the country right at your border, to Chile. Minister of Telecommunications and Transport, Gloria Hutt, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation to be present at this conference. Um, Chile at the COP presidency. You yourself, Minister Hutt, are, like the Secretary General Youngte mentioned, you are participate very often in the ITF events, in the summits we organize every year in Leipzig. You are, I can say this, a champion of transport decarbonization, I would say in the region, perhaps even the world. But without more delays, I will give the floor to you, and good morning, and thank you for being with us today. Just, she's muted.
Mario Meoni. Perdón.
Okay.
Ahora sí.
Can you hear me?
Quiero agradecer la invitación y
I would
saludar.
like to thank you for the invitation and especially greet the Secretary General, Yang Tai Kim. We meet regularly at events of the ITF, and I would also like to thank my colleague, Mario Meoni. I haven't met him in person, but I hope I can very soon. Karsten as well. It was an honor to hear your presentation. I would like to briefly summarize and describe the vision and the situation that we have currently in Chile. First of all, maybe I do not need to delve into this issue, but the pandemic has hit the transport sector very hard. And therefore, we have many areas of transport that have been severely affected in their operation. However, we also see that what happened could be considered like a large-scale experiment that we had never been able to put into practice in reality. There would be no chance otherwise to stop all cities to evaluate the impact of fewer travel and less activity. And we would have never stopped the activities in general as strongly as it happened worldwide. And what this has created is raise awareness of people in terms of controlling emissions in the cities. There is evidence of the positive impact that this reduction in travel has brought about, especially in terms of the quality of the environment in cities. Therefore, we are considering this situation as a new starting point, as a deep dive analysis of the focus points that we will be analyzing in the future. For example, the analysis of urban density as an efficient way to administer travel and transportation. But urban density is one of the most critical varieties right now to determine the risk perception that people have. So we need to reconfigure our plans. We have defined several pillars. One of them is working towards decarbonization, or at least continue working on decarbonization from the point of view of urban spaces and not just from the point of view of vehicles. This means not just replacing technology, but also making interventions so that urban cities and roads can be administered in a different way, so as to allow for better circulation and to have more space in a less contaminating way. We believe that managing space is a critical variable towards decarbonizing in an efficient manner and at the same time protect the people. Another goal that we have, which has been recommended by many international forums, is to maintain our focus on mass transportation. We believe that this is the best way to move about, and with this in mind, we have made great efforts to focus on technological reconversion. We hope to end 2020 with more than 2,000 buses renovated. That's 30% of our fleet, out of which more than 700 are electric. We believe that this is a major contribution to the quality of air, not just from the point of view of emissions, but also from the point of view of noise. The noise reduction is very palpable when these electrical buses are operating. In order to do this, we've developed new business models with public-private participation, and this has allowed us to focus on the issue of financing. As Minister Meoni said, although the initial cost of investment is high, in the long run, it is so much more affordable than diesel that the investment is recovered very quickly. Furthermore, with public-private association models that we've developed, we have been able to move forward in this reconversion without forcing the state to put in more funds for the subsidy of transportation. So the combination of electricity manufacturers and policymakers has been essential. We want to move towards electric mobility for buses and extend it throughout the country. We also want to move forward in the development of railways for short distances in order to allow the mobilization of a large number of passengers in a more sustainable way. We see with great concern that those countries that are starting to reopen and are starting to come out of the peak of the COVID-19 crisis are using their cars, their personal cars, very intensively, probably because they feel safer in a car that they can control. Therefore, this is very hard to recover. The use of public transportation is hard to recover. So we are focused on analyzing and preventing this from happening. We believe that using cars massively, again, would heavily damage cities. Therefore, we are working on measures that will make people feel confident so that when things reopen, they can go back to using public transportation and not their personal vehicles. We believe that this crisis has also allowed us to prioritize and organize the movement of people and of freight. When we've had to define, for example, essential services and essential movements or mobilization, with this in mind, we can organize better in the future in such a way as to establish, for example, access to cities in the places with a larger amount of cars or where there's more pollution in a more sustainable way. We also see that the development of technology and information for planning and for travel decisions that people make are fundamental right now. Communication technologies currently are pretty much supporting the economic life and the social and family life of the population. And this has gained an essential role, and we must develop tools so that people can make better travel decisions in an effective way as well. In this way, we may replace travel with certain platforms for communication, such as we are doing in this forum. If we calculate how much we would have spent in terms of emissions, if we had held this meeting in person, may be a way to think about these things. We are also concerned about economic recovery, of course. The economy has been hit hard in the countries, and in order to recover, we will need to make great efforts. We are focusing on 3 pillars that are part of the fears that people are dealing with in emerging or when emerging from the crisis. The first one is the fear of contracting the disease. If this fear is not eliminated, then the economy will never recover, and we want people to feel safe. A second fear is a fear for their employment, for their jobs, and this of course affects the level of activity. And the third fear is a fear of a prolonged economic crisis. So if we plan only based on vehicles, or if we plan only focusing on cities and not understanding how people are reacting and how people are making their decisions, we will never reach our objectives. So our strategy is to build the trust in the population while also trying to create an environment where recovery and returning to normal activities will find people with better travel conditions, with more safety, better conditions for travel, and also trying to identify those strong gaps in Latin America and between the different cities and try to bridge those gaps as much as possible. This crisis has also made evident, or more evident, these gaps that already existed. So we have to work towards decarbonization, but also towards the well-being of citizens and towards a general efficiency of the economic system. In order to do this, we need to recalculate our strategic plans, and we hope that with this we will be able to afford more well-being to our citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Gloria Hutt, for your words and for the several items you mentioned during your speech. And for instance, that indeed this is was and is a large scale experience of how cities can be without so much traffic and without so much car traffic. But now, as you mentioned, there is also the risk or the danger, which is to a great extent, I must say, understandable, of people wanting to be safe and because of that getting back to their cars in an even bigger way than before. But for that, as you mentioned, there is a need to readjust our plans. We can have an opportunity here, and it's already happening in many cities, of reconfiguring the public space and how this public space is used. So I would highlight also this room for opportunity that this moment offers to us. And again, thank you very much for your participation. And now I would move to the organizations that were involved in also setting up this conference. Besides the International Transport Forum, we already heard from our Secretary General, Yang Kim, but I would move to Francisco Maciel. He's from the Let's Lack platform. Bom dia, Francisco. Good morning. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Francisco. And I'd like to thank you for the invitation, Mr. Yang, Jochen, Mr. Mario Meoni, and Mrs. Gloria Hutt for leveraging my speech, pretty much. You know. And we at Let's Lack, I was thinking about a new way to present it, because I'm always presenting Let's Lack, you know, but I'm going to present this way. We are a platform for low-emission development systems in Latin America and Caribbean as a branch for the Global Partnership Platform. That's as the name says, global. And we over here in the area, we answer for, we have 2,000 members that connected. And if you connected this 2,000 member with another direct 10 people by each, you're going to talk about 20,000 people that work with low emission development systems. And if you consider that in Latin America and Caribbean and the indirect people that work with them, we are pretty much talking about everyone that is some way or another working on low emission development system in Latin America and Caribbean. So we pretty much answer for the ecosystem of low emission development systems with all the teams that are involved in that. in sense, and I would like to do a special thanks to Gloria before me, because she touched things that I was about to go in deeper, and it's wonderful to go after her. Thank you. And what I'm gonna say is a little bit about our Latin American Caribbean area, talking about what was the new thing on transportation and mobility, pretty much urban areas before COVID and after the pandemic. Okay, and so I divided it into 4 new things that we were facing on that, on that theme. The first one would be on the planning and monitoring, and I'm gonna, mention several companies, not because we are related to that in some strange sense, but just because they are related with us on this issue. Okay, so in planning and monitoring, we were right, coming from a traditional way to plan and monitor when we had the OD, research that was usually run, every and each 10 years to plan and monitor with Google Maps, with Waze, with TomTom, with Microsoft platforms, besides the dedicated platforms. That was a change, between something that we had like very poor relation with data from time to time, to something that we have, actually daily data to analyze, and that's sometimes a problem as well. But in the terms of rides, and pretty much I'm talking about rides right now. I'm not talking about mass transportation or individual transportation. I'm talking about the way people go from one place to another. We were facing, we're still facing the Uber's, era, with the Didi Chung area, just in the side of it with a different model, Cabify, Lyft, and all the locals, and the niches on rides as Lady, that only rides with, women drivers and women going with them. And we're talking about pooling, and in the sense of cars, several local companies of carpooling, but we are starting to have ways operating on that. In another way, a little bit, coming back from something that we're, talking about in the past, we're talking about sharing bikes, of course, and they're all electric, sharing scooters, and they're all electric, the ones that are not, but the bikes are not, that we are not doing the effort were electric, the scooters all electric, and the cars, some of the cars already electric, and with several companies with different models like Zipcars, Car2Go, Turbi here in Brazil. And I will take, a specific, look into Maven, because Maven is General Motors company, So we are talking about a company that used to do cars and to sell them to the population, doing car sharing, and after COVID. And so this was already happening, before pandemic. And after that, we have a situation that we had last week, a report coming from the Financial Times telling us the prosperity that we have in companies during the pandemic. And there's no new on that, in the sense of what was, those companies, who are those companies? And we have, most of them are e-commerce companies or health e-commerce. The very first one is Amazon, and the fourth one is Tesla. What is something strange in that is that Tesla is the only company between 10 companies that are prospering in the pandemic that is completely related to mobility. Okay, and the relation Tesla has with mobility outside the new technology they are presenting is something very old. The changing on mass mobility or car mobility from gasoline to electric is not a new thing. The way to do it might be new, but it's not a new discussion. And that's the only company on mobility it's among the 100 companies that are prospering in the pandemic. On the other way, the rides ones, well, the rides that can adapt to the situation and are resilient, they are going up. The pooling is going down. And see, the rides, the ones that can adapt, means the ones that people are not afraid to go into car. As Gloria told us, people prefer to go in cars, but people prefer to go in cabs. People prefer to go in Ubers. Well, it depends. It depends on how those systems adapt to the situation. Okay, pooling it's a poor situation that they are not adapting. So if you're going to a bike, you are under some kind of problems because you're over there in an open area and you're transpiring, you're respiring, inspiring, expiration, and everything. And on the other side, you're taking a car that you don't know, who was in the car before you, and so pooling is going down, sharing is struggling, okay? And you have the delivery, meaning that you have on the other side more bikers, more scooters, more riders on the street, just doing the diversification of the delivery. In that sense, what we're facing in the urban areas is the changing, coming from a centric system where we are really worried about transportation, people from one neighborhood to another, to a polycentric urban planning systems and development. That is saying, I tell you, a very short example of yesterday. Yesterday I was in my office. Right now I'm at home in my home office, but yesterday I was in my office, and we on that area we have 8,000 people running every day, and I was there yesterday, and we didn't have, and we are running into flexibility right now. We didn't have even 20% of those over there, and the planning looking into those companies that are pretty much international companies, that they're not coming back this year. They might be having people like 1 or 2 days a week, but they're not coming back. So there's a completely change, in the sense of what's demanding. Of course, the relationship between the cities and the ministries and the companies that are used to run in the usual way, is going to be complex, because you have to go to a bus company and say, hey, we can, make it a little better. We can have more room internally, but there's a competition between that and people staying at their homes, and that there is a complete consequence on that on two senses. The first one, of course, is on the emissions. You have more people working from their homes or their neighborhoods. They're going to emit less, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, of course. That's one thing. But the other thing is completely related with the economic recovery that we're going to see. It's kind of awkward. We think that the economic recovery is going to happen the same way we did have on track beforehand. So, and when you talk about this spread way of living cities, urban and transportation and mobility, you're talking about several new economies, small economies that are completely related with a green recovery on SMEs rather than reinforcing the big ones. And even though if we're talking about emerging countries, we are talking about countries that are used to informal people working. And the informal people working to formality, the easiest way to do it is through SMEs that pretty much answers for most of the employment in the world. So this scenario pretty much says that we are probably, you have a special look when you're talking about transportation and urban mobility. You have to have a special look on what the innovation and technology is bringing us in the sense of how they respond to the demands that we have from the population, from the cities right now. I really think, and I'm seeing several countries, that we are all fighting to come back to some way to the track that we were into. And we listening to this speech saying, oh, okay, we are going to a new reality, new economy, new scenario. Okay, we are listening to that every time, but in fact, we are going into a new relation, between people and employment and economy, and we have several ways to accelerate it if we can respond to that in this way. In the other sense, it's going to be hard if we keep on tracking on the same things. I'm going to thank you guys. My time is running out, and let's see what our experts are going to bring us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you for bringing the issue of the new data sources that exist. And in this world and for the transport challenges that we face, and decarbonizing economic recovery, one of the things that we in the ITF mentioned in several of our projects, it's the need to have sound data, the need to also use better data that is already available, but sometimes not available to the public institutions, but to use that data for better analysis and better understanding, and with that also generate better policies to address these issues. But now, and a bit continuing here in the topic of cities, I introduce Oliver La. He's the head of the mobility and the International Cooperation Research Unit at the Wuppertal Institute. The Wuppertal Institute, as I mentioned, is implementing the Decarbonizing Transport in Emerging Economies project together with the ITF. Their work is particularly focused on the cities and the mobility in cities. And Oliver, I'll give the floor to you now. Good evening.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be here. Honorable ministers, dear colleagues from the BMU and from the ITF, it's great to be here with you. Thanks for touching on our role already. So we'd like to bring in the urban perspective on this. And that's the Wuppertal Institute. So it's a think tank based in Germany and owned by the government of North Rhine-Westphalia. And we're around 200 people based in Wuppertal and in Berlin. And into this project, we bring the city's perspective, and our work revolves around supporting decision makers at the local and national level. So connecting those two quite essential dots, but also bringing in the perspective of mobility operators and local entrepreneurs, in particular in this time of the economic recovery. We would like to identify not just the policies at the local and national level, but also opportunities for business models of low carbon mobility services. That involves technical support, capacity building on urban governance, on business modeling, impact assessment, and policy integration between the local and international level. And that sort of follows a structured approach that we bring into this partnership with our friends from the ITF. And our perspective starts from informing decision makers on a range of tools, methods, guides on low carbon mobility solutions. And then we work between city officials from various cities that we work with and try to inspire them to take up solutions that have been developed by their peers from around the world. We build on a partnership of 20 living labs in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and over 100 implementation partners in all those regions. So there's quite a robust range of partnerships that we can bring into this. And then we try to initiate small-scale interventions and then bring them to scale. That builds on operational models and business models that we adapt to the local context. And then we work very closely with our partner cities, and this is where we are particularly enthusiastic about this partnership with Argentina on innovative solutions that we intend to implement, test the technical feasibility, work on the cost-benefit analysis and the institutional and governance framework. And then the fifth level is working on the impact. This is, of course, where we intend to work closely with also financing partners, but also business and industry that can take those solutions forward. And this work that we bring into this project builds on another EC-funded project, which is called Urban Pathways and the Urban Electric Mobility Initiative, both of which we implement with our friends from UN Habitat, and another project called Solutions Plus, which helps us also to support local entrepreneurs and businesses on taking up innovative business solutions. And we're very delighted to work on this project with our ITF friends in Argentina. We have had an initial engagement already with local partners from Argentina. And we are about to engage with a couple of local authorities on the local impact assessment and the work that we can do on the capacity building and needs assessment. And we will continue to engage with cities on identifying the technical and capacity needs, identify suitable partnerships, and then develop policy scenarios that mutually strengthen the local and national actions towards the decarbonization pathways for Argentina, but then would also, of course, like to reach out more broadly to the region and facilitate this exchange with the other partner countries in this program. And that's sort of a key cornerstone for our approach in this exchange. And we would like to thank again the German Environment Ministry, which we are blessed to have a good long-standing partnership with, and our friends from the ITF, and of course also a big thanks to the government of Argentina for this great support. And yeah, we really look forward to this collaboration in the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Thank you very much for your intervention and these reflections on also the future of the work, particularly in respect to the cities. I must say that the decarbonizing transport in emerging economies, it goes on 4 different countries and regions. In each of the countries and regions, the focus is slightly different. In the Argentinian case, also due to the nature of the country, and you had the opportunity to listen to the intervention from Minister Mario Meoni, the issue of the freight transport over long distances, it's a very relevant issue. So in Argentina, the focus is a bit more on the freight part, but as you've seen from the previous interventions and even some of the sessions we will have throughout July, we are also addressing the urban issues and the passenger issues. And I must mention also that ITF, in parallel with the Decarbonizing Transport in Emerging Economies project, and Youngte mentioned that, is also working in the Decarbonizing Transport in Latin American cities, which in one of the cities being Buenos Aires too. So, but after this short explanation, I move now to the last speaker, not of the day. It's not the last speaker of the day, but it's the last speaker of this session, Carolina Chantrel from the Associação Sustentar, which has been one of the key persons in the organization of this event. But Carolina, I think it's still good morning there in Argentina. So good morning, and I give you now the floor.
Muchas gracias, Francisco.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Good morning, everyone, and good evening, everyone. I would like to say, first and foremost, that I'm really honored to be collaborating on this project and this conference, having opened this event with renowned authorities from different organizations we are working with. I would like to especially thank Yang Kim for initiating this dialogue and organizing this event. Also to thank the representation of the Ministry of the Environment in Germany, Mr. Minister, you are responsible for the financing of this project and in many of the projects we work on. I would like to particularly thank Mario Meoni, the Ministry of Transport of Argentina, without whom, whose joint work with ITF, this project would not be possible, and also for the will to participate and support in everything this entails. Also, I would like to thank Minister Gloria Hutt for her participation, Francisco Maciel as president of the platform Let's LAC, and seconding what Oliver was saying, as part of the participating organization, I think this is a key space for the collaboration and to develop and build capacities collectively in the region in Argentina, as well as in global level. I would like to introduce myself. As Francisco was saying, I'm Carolina Chantril. I'm responsible for the coordination of the Sustentar Association. This association is a civil organization, it's an NGO, it's a non-for-profit organization in Argentina devoted to the promotion of sustainability and to support the development of capacities. From the association, we coordinate the working group Let's LAC, and we are co-responsible for the group at global level for Let's Global Partnership. Sustentar is, since 2014, is responsible for transportation also, and also part of the board and of directors and collaborating at the international level. Just like the preceding authorities, I would like to welcome all participants that are joining us today, and I would like to thank the audience and the speakers and authorities that are going to be part of the conference in the next weeks. Regarding the dynamic of the conference, I will take what Mr. Furtado said at the beginning. The conference will have 10 virtual sessions. The first will take place after this opening.
Aquí me gustaría compartirles de nuevo.
I would like to share once again the agenda for the day. After this session, tomorrow will be the first thematic session that will focus on road freight, and then we will have railway, waterways, urban logistics, transport, metropolitan governments, and the relation with transport and territorial section, with the closing session to decarbonizing policies. We invite you to log into the different sessions, and together we are going to explore the different policies of decarbonizing policies and how they can contribute to resilience, in particular in a context of severe stress caused by COVID-19 pandemic. All panels are made up of decision makers, strategic developers, and experts. After each presentation, there will be dialogues and Q&A moderated, receiving questions from the audience. We hope this exchange can strengthen dialogue and collective knowledge and the challenges of freight transportation to diminish the impact on carbon footprint in the light of the COP commitment in a crisis situation as this. The conference is open and free for all. Prior registration sessions will be recorded and will be a part of the, we'll have a synthesis. All sessions will have simultaneous interpretation into English, Spanish, and Portuguese. We will be focusing on a dialogue in networks, especially Twitter, using the hashtags that you see on the screen, and LinkedIn group associated to this conference. Participants and interested members can be used to share knowledge and ask questions. Without further ado, once again, I would like to thank all the authorities that were part of this opening. It is an honor to be part of this group, and we are going to take a 10-minute break to later resume with the first panel called Decarbonization of Transport and Resilience that will set the tone for exchanges in the next few weeks. Thank you very much for your participation, and we will resume in 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very muchas gracias.
As she was mentioning now, this with her speech, we close the first session of the conference, but not the conference for today, because we will take just a short 10-minute break. And after this short 10-minute break, we will come with the next session, decarbonizing economic recovery and resilience, which is the overall theme of this conference. And we'll have Nestor Roa from the Inter-American Development Bank. We'll have Jose Barbero, reputed expert in transportation in Argentina. We'll have Jean-Paul Rodrigue, also international expert on the subject. And this will to discuss a bit in a deeper way how to exactly coordinate these three desperate things, but that need to go together: decarbonizing, economic recovery, and increased resilience of the transportation system. I won't say much more. I'll just thank again every guest speaker, particularly Minister Mario Meoni from Argentina, Minister Gloria Hutt from Chile, States Director General Carsten Sach from Germany, and Young Tae Kim from our Secretary General from the ITF for their presence. All of the previous speakers too. I think there's a lot we can take from each of their speeches. Building back better, as was mentioned by the Director General Carsten Sach, it's really key at this moment. The broad overview given by Minister Meoni of the initiatives that are going on in Argentina is another highlight of this first session. And initiatives, I won't go into all of them, but that include the move towards electrification, also modal shift both in passengers and in the freight sector. Minister Gloria Hutt brought the perspective from a city perspective, highlighting what a large-scale experience this crisis has been, and how this allows us to also have an opportunity to reconfigure the city space and to build back better, and to have an economic recovery based on sustainability. Francisco Maciel also mentioned the issue of new data sources, new mobility forms that will also play a role, and some of them are being affected positively, others negatively with this crisis, but it's also a sector, important sector to have an eye on. But without further ado, and I'll close this first session, and in 10 minutes we will be back. Thank you very much, everyone.
Damos inicio al primer panel de esta conferencia virtual, Descarbonizando el Transporte en tiempos de una
We
crisis
will
global.
begin with the first session of this conference, Decarbonizing the Economy in this Unprecedented Global Crisis. This panel is called Decarbonizing Transport and Recovering the Economy. Before I present the panelists, I would like to mention a few features for those of you who are just joining us. We have simultaneous interpretation into English, into Spanish, and into Portuguese. In order to do this, you have to select the globe icon on your Zoom app. Please bear in mind that you should not silence the original audio. Otherwise, you will not be able to hear the speakers when they are speaking your language of choice. You also have two functions available. In the chat, you will be able to receive messages from us with information that is important or of interest to you. And we also have the Q&A feature for questions and comments that will be compiled and conveyed to the speakers once they finish their presentation. This session, as well as all other sessions in this meeting, will be recorded and published in English and Spanish on the website of the conference. We will also share summary of the sessions today. For those of you who did not participate in the opening ceremony, I am Carolina Chantril. I will be moderating this panel, and I'm the coordinator of the Sustainable Mobility Team of the Sustentar Association. And this panel will be comprised of Nestor Roa. He is of the Transport Division of the Inter-American Development Bank. Gonzalo Munoz, he is a Chilean high-level champion of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Jean-Paul Rodrigue, he is an international expert and an academic from the Hofstra University. And Jose Barbero is the Dean of the Transportation Institute at the National University of San Martin in Argentina. On behalf of the organizing committee of this conference, we would like to welcome you and thank you for your participation in this session. As an introduction, and before I give you the floor, I would like to make a few remarks. As you very well know, this conference in the transport sector accounts for 23% of emissions within the energy sector, and this was mentioned by the authorities at the beginning of this conference. And according to some recent reports, the freight segment had increased its emissions about 75% between 2000 and 2015, and it is expected to continue growing, except for the uncertainty brought about by the pandemic. The speakers have mentioned at the beginning of the conference the importance of transport, both in the sense of the spread of the disease, but also in terms of the stocking of essential inputs, food products, etc. It is also important to mention the importance of maintaining economic activity while strengthening growing trends in terms of virtual and e-commerce. This was also mentioned before. This panel will focus on answering the following questions. How can the transport decarbonization agenda be adapted to this period of severe crisis? How transport decarbonization, economic recovery, and added resilience to transport systems can be combined? In the short and medium term, what will be the greatest challenges and opportunities to jointly address climate change mitigation and sustainable economic development? These are just starting points or questions that can be asked in terms of this subject, but we hope it will enrich the exchange of ideas in order to strengthen public policies in the sector and make them more dynamic so that they can be effectively and quickly implemented. Without further ado, I will introduce the first speaker. Nestor Roa, as I said before, is the chief of the transport division of the Inter-American Development Bank, IADB. He has worked at the IADB since 2001, and he currently coordinates the he is the chief of the division of transportation, and he has coordinated the transport divisions in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. He had a successful career in the Colombian public sector, where, among other positions, he was director and commissioner of the Communications Regulatory Commission. He has a master's in technology from the Sloan School of Business of MIT. He has a master's in transport engineering, and he has another degree in civil engineering in Bogota. Nestor, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Muchas gracias, Carolina. Solo quiero verificar que me escuchan bien.
Carolina. Can you all hear me okay?
Gracias. Bueno, y es un placer para mí estar en este evento. Muchas gracias a ITF. Un agradecimiento a ti, Carolina, por la moderación y a mis colegas de panel, Gonzalo, Jean-Paul y José,
and thank you, of course, to my fellow panelists with whom I will be sharing, and we will be sharing very fruitful experiences.
Compartir mi
I will
pantalla,
try to share my
si soy
screen.
exitoso.
I will see if I succeed in this endeavor.
Ok, ahí parece que
It seems to be working.
compartiendo, ¿verdad? Bueno, perfecto.
Can you see my screen? Very well.
Sin más, yo creo que para hablar un poco del marco de recuperación económica
I think that in order to talk
y
about
resiliencia hacia adelante,
economic cooperation and
es clave
resilience
centrarnos un poco en
facing forward,
cómo ha
it
sido
is
la evolución de
key
este proceso
to
que
focus on the
los días
evolution
parecen semanas,
of this
como decían al
process,
principio, y las
where
semanas parecen
days
meses,
seem
pero en
like
realidad es muy
weeks,
poco
weeks
tiempo, y
seem
yo creo
like
que vale la
months,
pena
but it's
hacer
actually a very
un
short
marco
time that
general de
has elapsed.
cómo hemos venido
So
recorriendo
I would like to describe a bit the
esta
general
emergencia, ¿no? Lo primero,
framework.
que nosotros llamamos la fase 1, y esto
Firstly,
es muy
we
de la
have
perspectiva
phase
del Banco
1.
Interamericano de Desarrollo, es lo que nosotros llamaríamos la respuesta inmediata
And
a la
this is what
emergencia,
we
¿no?
call
Desde que
the
se reportó el
immediate
primer caso,
response
todos
to the
empezamos a prepararnos
emergency. After the
rápidamente.
first case, we all started to
En el
prepare,
sector
started
hubo declaración de
preparing.
estados de emergencia,
In the
cierre de
sector,
fronteras,
emergency was
suspensión de vuelos
declared, the borders were
internacionales y el
closed,
transporte
international
público,
flights were
autoaislamiento, en algunos
suspended,
casos
public
obligatorio, en otros
transportation,
casos
self-isolation,
voluntario,
sometimes mandatory,
incluso
sometimes
enforcement muy
voluntary,
importante con cuarentenas, toque de
and
queda,
quarantines, curfews,
y ese
etc.
fue como
This was the
la primera
first
etapa que vivimos, ¿no?
stage.
Aquí fue muy importante asegurar
Here,
la
it was
continuidad de los servicios de
very
transporte de
important to
carga,
ensure the
particularmente
continuity of freight
para los
transport,
materiales
especially
esenciales,
for
para los
essential inputs,
materiales médicos, a la
medical
vez que se aseguraba el
supplies,
servicio, ¿no? En
all
la fase
while
2,
ensuring
que empieza
their
más adelante,
distribution.
es donde
In
empezamos
the
un poco a
second
ver cómo
phase,
mitigamos las
started
disrupciones que se dieron de
seeing
manera
how to
generalizada
mitigate
en las
certain
cadenas de
impacts that
suministro.
were
Acá la recuperación
generalized within the
de
supply
transportes
chain.
de los sistemas de transporte de
The
carga.
recovery of
En el
freight
caso particular del
transport
banco, nosotros
services and
somos financiadores
systems.
importantes de la
In the case of our
infraestructura de
bank, we
transporte
finance the
interurbano
infrastructure, the
y
transport,
urbano.
the
Fue
interurban
muy
and
importante
urban
todo este proceso de
transportation
adopción de
systems.
protocolos de
So for us,
bioseguridad
it
para
was
la
very
continuidad de
important
las
to
obras.
implement
Apoyamos
biosafety
mucho nosotros
protocols
mediante
for the
eventos
continuity
como
of the
este
works.
en compartir rápidamente
And of
las
course,
ideas y los problemas que los
sharing
países
all of this with the rest of the
iban enfrentando.
countries. And as the
Y lo
countries
que
were
se buscaba
facing
también era
these
dar prioridad
problems, we
a la
also sought
seguridad
to give
alimentaria
priority
y
to
al
food
acceso
security and, of
de
course,
capital de trabajo.
access
Y
to
luego, que es un
working
poco lo que
capital.
estamos empezando, hay un solapamiento entre esta
And
etapa de
there is a bit of an
mitigación que
overlap
durará un tiempo.
between
Nosotros
this
creemos por lo menos hasta
mitigation
que
phase, which will
se llegue a la
last
estabilidad
a
sanitaria,
while
bien sea
longer until
porque se
reaching
puede hacer
stability
prevención o existe una vacuna, como todos sabemos,
and
estamos
until
hablando de
there is some
horizontes
kind of
de
prevention or some
todavía de
kind of
pronto de hasta un
vaccine.
año o algo más, dependiendo del
We
escenario
are
económico.
probably talking about
Hacia
1
adelante vamos
year,
a
it
tener que
depends.
convivir
So
y
facing
mitigar los
forward, we will
impactos
need to
del
coexist and
COVID. Yo
mitigate
creo
the
que ahí
impacts of
es
COVID-19. And I think here,
podemos actuar de manera más importante nosotros.
Where we can
Entonces,
have a higher
ese es el contexto,
incidence
un contexto
from our
cronológico
perspective.
de
So this
apenas
is a bit of a
poco menos de un
chronology,
semestre,
a
donde se está planteando el
context
futuro de
in
varios años
a
adelante,
little
donde
less
así lo
than
estamos
6
viendo
months,
nosotros en el
and
banco
that
en
sets
términos
the
de nuestra
stage
actividad
for
de diálogo
many
sectorial
years
y
to
de
come,
seguimiento, ¿no?
including sector-based
¿Qué fue
dialogues
lo que
and other
ocurrió? Y
issues.
creo que se ha hablado en el panel de apertura del evento.
So
Ha habido un shock de oferta y demanda
what
muy,
has
muy
happened
pronunciado
is that there's been a
que ha
shock
tomado
on
en
supply and
términos de nuestro
demand, of
sector
course,
un protagonismo
in our
muy
sector.
importante. Ha estado en los titulares de los diarios de todo el mundo, de todos
It's
los países, de
been
todas
in
las
the
ciudades.
headlines of all the
Hay un shock de
newspapers
demanda,
throughout the
como mencionaba antes, de
world.
productos
Like I said, there's a
esenciales,
demand
cosas
shock
tan básicas como el
for
papel
essential
sanitario, productos
products
de
such
limpieza,
as toilet paper cleaning
alcohol,
products,
mascarillas,
alcohol,
termómetros, como la continuidad de
thermometers, but
suministro de
also
alimentos
a shock on the continuity of food supply.
y otros que se necesitaban, ¿no? De manera simultánea, se dio un shock de oferta en las cadenas
Simultaneously,
globales de
there was a
suministro.
shock
Hubo
of
cierres de
supply in
fábricas,
global
cierres de
supply
fábricas, nodos
chains.
de cadenas de suministro globales.
And of
Hubo
course, at a
disminución en las
global
operaciones
level, there
portuarias
was a reduction in
y
port
aeroportuarias y del sector
operations, airport
férreo, y
operations,
se
and
produjeron bloqueos
railway
incluso de
as well.
suministro de insumos para el sector industrial, y creo que un caso
And this created some problems in the
paradigmático en
supply
la
of
región de
industrial
Latinoamérica y el
supplies. This
Caribe ha sido el tema de la
created some
industria
problems in Latin
automotriz, que es
America
una
and
cadena
Caribbean,
global
especially in
que
the
ha
automotive
sufrido.
industry,
Entonces,
which is a global
eso fue
supply chain that has
lo que
suffered the
ocurrió de manera más
impacts.
específica en el
This
sector
happened
de
more
transporte, como nosotros
specifically
lo vemos
in our
hacia adelante.
sector.
¿Y qué es lo que estamos
And
viendo hacia adelante? Entonces, lo
what are
primero
we
es
seeing facing
hay
forward?
un desafío de liquidez
There
en el
is
sector, en
a
el subsector de
liquidity
transporte de carga,
challenge
que es más
in
amplio, y esto
the
es
freight
importante
transport
entenderlo. Cuando hablamos
sector.
del transporte de
And it's
carga,
important to
no es solo
understand
un
that
problema de
when we
liquidez
talk
del
about
sistema
freight,
o el modo de
we are
transporte de
not
carga,
just
también
talking
del de pasajeros, y de hecho de toda la industria, ¿no? De toda la
about,
industria,
I
y
mean, we talk about freight
particularmente en
specifically,
América
but this
Latina,
affects
donde
the
la mayor
entire
composición del
industry.
tejido
And in Latin
productivo se
America,
basa en
the productive
microempresas y pequeñas y
network
medianas
is
empresas,
based
¿no?
on
Un
micro
ejercicio
businesses and
de
small
microsimulación que
businesses.
realizamos en el
So this is
banco
a
para estimar
bit
la solvencia de las
the
empresas de transporte,
simulation that we
específicamente
did
de
at the
carga,
bank to
considerando tres
analyze the
escenarios
solvency
de
of the
disminución
companies,
de ventas,
analyzing
¿no? 20,
3
40 y
scenarios,
60%,
20,
y
40, and
asumiendo que se
60%
tomaban
drop
medidas
in
similares de
sales,
rescate y de apoyo
considering
como
that
las que se
similar
toman en
measures
Europa,
were
que pasarían pagos de
adopted
impuestos por un
for
año para evitar
relief, for
el
rescue,
financiamiento de las
tax
empresas a tasa de
exemptions, or
interés cero,
financing
y
these
ver si esto era
companies with a
suficiente
zero
para
interest rate,
reducir por
etc.
lo menos el
These
impacto
types of
inmediato
measures
del COVID.
to at least
Con estas
mitigate or
políticas
reduce
en
the
marcha,
impact of
nosotros
COVID-19.
lo que
And
vimos es
with
que
these
cerca de un
policies in
60% de las empresas
place,
de la región podrían seguir
60% of the
operando durante
companies
los
in the
primeros
region could
5 meses
continue operating during the
desde que se
first
inició
5 months
la pandemia,
since the
sin
beginning
tener
of
que
the
despedir
pandemic
a personal. Una
without
de cada
having
dos
to
empresas
fire any
lo
staff
podría hacer
members.
en un escenario
And this could
moderado,
be
mientras que el
done in a
40%
moderate
apenas resistiría
scenario,
un choque
but
más
40%
acentuado. En
only
particular,
would resist
estas
this type of
políticas
shock of these policies.
amortiguarían el impacto en las
And they
microempresas,
would,
dado que 3 de 4 de ellas saldrían del mercado,
I mean, 3 out
de
of
las que
4
corresponden
would
a
have to
Entonces tenemos
leave
un
their
desafío de
market.
liquidez
So we
en las
have a
empresas
liquidity
y
challenge
en el
for
sistema,
companies.
un sistema que en muchos países se caracteriza por
And
una
this
participación
system
muy
in many
importante del sector
countries
informal, al cual es
has,
difícil llegar
I mean, a very
por parte del
strong
gobierno por los
informal
mecanismos
sector.
tradicionales, ¿no? Entonces, tenemos la
So we
secuencia
have
que estaba comentando de la crisis hasta el día
the
de hoy, lo que
sequence that I
viene
was
hacia adelante por el
mentioning,
próximo
the
año y
crisis that
medio
we
y un
see
impacto
for the
más
future, for
largo
the
en
next
los
year,
próximos
year and a
5
half,
años.
and of
Y
course a
luego
longer
algunas
term impact.
oportunidades de este gran reto que estamos
I also see
observando,
opportunities
¿no?
within these
Y es
challenges that we
las
are
mejoras que se han
facing.
dado
The
en
improvements that
contaminación, y lo
we've
mencionaba
seen
la
in
ministra
the
y el
levels
ministro
of
y varios de
contamination,
los
as was mentioned by the
participantes en
ministers
el panel
in the
de
opening
instalación.
remarks.
Tuvimos básicamente
We
un
had
experimento
a
natural, donde en la
natural
ciudad de Buenos Aires
experiment
solo el dióxido de
where
nitrógeno como
in the
referencia, si lo
city of
tomamos como
Buenos
referencia,
Aires,
la presencia de gases
taking
se redujo
as
hasta
a
en un
consideration
50% en
carbon
las primeras
dioxide,
semanas del
NO2,
confinamiento,
sorry, in the
según datos
atmosphere
oficiales. O
dropped
sea, estamos observando en
significantly,
varias
as we can
ciudades y
see
esto lo
in the
podemos ver de
screen. So
manera
we are
repetida en
observing this
diferentes
in many
instancias,
cities, and we're
unos
seeing it
beneficios
repeatedly.
ambientales
So
inmediatos
the environmental benefits
y
that we are
temporales,
observing are
pero
immediate, and we can
importante
see it in
entender que
real
estos
time. But
beneficios
it's
no van a
important to
reemplazar
understand that these
las
benefits will
acciones
not replace
sobre
the
las que estamos ya
actions that we are
comprometidos
already
y que eran urgentes
implementing
previo a
and
la
that we are
pandemia,
committed
y eso es muy
to and
importante.
that were
Pero sí
urgent even
es
before
una
the pandemic.
demostración de lo que se puede,
But it is
lograr.
proof
Pero
of
como
what
digo,
could be
no nos
achieved.
podemos descuidar,
As
¿no?
I
La
said
recesión del
before,
2008, las
we
emisiones
should
mundiales de
not
CO2 se
neglect
redujeron solamente
these
en un 1%
issues
y
because
luego
the reduction was
volvieron a
only
aumentar
1%,
de manera
was
incluso
only
más
1%, but
acelerada
then increased
precisamente
even
por los
more
estímulos de los planes de reactivación
quickly
económica que se
because
dieron
of the
en el
stimulus
mundo y en los
plans and
países,
the
¿no?
recovery measures that
Entonces,
were implemented in the different
¿qué
countries.
podemos hacer, ¿no?
So what can we do?
Para conjugar de manera paralela el tema de decarbonización y reactivación económica.
How can we
Lo primero es usar
combine
los estímulos económicos para
decarbonization and
apoyar
economic
un
recovery?
cambio que
I think
aborde
that
la actual
the
emergencia
economic measures
climática,
have
¿no? O sea, todos los
to
apoyos de
include
recuperación
the issue
deberían
of
estar
climate change.
orientados
All of
hacia que
the
el nuevo
measures
normal sea mucho
aimed at
más
recovery
sostenible, ¿no?
have to focus on a
Y
new normal that
esta es una
is more
oportunidad para
sustainable. And this is an
estimular la
opportunity
innovación,
to
atender
stimulate
fallas de mercado que
innovation
ya
and
existen,
address
e
market failures
introducir
that already exist.
eficiencias en los sistemas
Also, it
logísticos
needs
para
to
mejorar la calidad
introduce efficiency in logistics systems
de los
to
servicios,
improve
¿no?
the
Y de
quality
esta
of
manera reducir
services.
las emisiones.
And in this
El
way,
nuevo rol de
reducing
la política pública
the new
debe
role
estar
of public
enfocado desde la cadena de
policies
suministro
must
para
be
entender
focused
mejor
on the
el
supply
sector,
chain to better understand the
particularmente temas
sector,
muy peculiares en América Latina y el Caribe, como
particularly
el tema de la
very
informalidad que
specific
mencionaba
issues of the LAC
más
region.
adelante. Hacer énfasis en la regulación
So
técnica
focus on
es clave
technical
en los programas de
regulations
renovación de flota
is
que
essential
se vayan
to
realizando,
renew the
y en un
fleets
contexto
if that is to be
fiscal
done.
complejo que tienen todos los
Of
países,
course, the
donde ya
fiscal
de liquidez
scenario is
que
very
el sector
complex in these countries,
público
and
observan,
there
se
has to
requieren nuevos
be
esquemas de colaboración
public-private
público-privado. Va a haber muy pocos
collaboration.
recursos
There will
públicos
be very
disponibles en
few
general para
public
cualquier tipo de
resources
inversión.
available in general
Entonces se
for
tiene
any
que
kind of
apalancar y
investment.
aprovechar
So I
para
think we have
traer
to leverage
y
this
aprovechar esa
situation in
liquidez
order
que
to
sí existe
bring
en el
in
sector
that
privado
liquidity
hoy
that does
día, pero
exist
que
in
no
the
se puede
private sector
canalizar por la
nowadays,
problemática
but
de
that
riesgos que
cannot
tiene.
be channeled because of the
Y ya
problems
tratando
that
de
exist.
terminar, porque el tiempo
And now
está llegando,
I am reaching the
yo
end
creo
of my
que
presentation, and
tenemos que
I believe that
aprovechar y
we need
apalancar también
to
el tema
fully
de tecnología,
leverage
¿no?
the
Se han
issue of
mencionado varios temas
technology.
hoy, no voy a
This
profundizar
has been
mucho sobre
mentioned
ellos, pero
already,
vehículos
but of
cero
course,
emisiones, movilidad
focusing on zero emission
eléctrica y
vehicles,
aplicaciones de
electric
tecnología como puede ser la
mobility, and
inteligencia artificial
applications of
para optimizar
technology
la
such
calidad de
as
los servicios,
artificial intelligence to
son
improve the quality of
elementos
services.
claves
These
que
are
tenemos que
key
tratar de
elements
aprovechar
that
mientras nos
we need to
aproximamos
fully
a este proceso de
leverage as
recuperación
we
más
approach
sostenible. El banco
this
como tal, y
sustainable
ya
future. Our
empezando a
bank
cerrar, está muy enfocado en
is
tratar de
focusing very strongly
apoyar este
on
proceso
supporting
este proceso
this
súper rápido
process
de atención a la crisis que se ha requerido. Lo
to
primero
deal
ha sido
with the
proveyendo
crisis. The
recursos
first
financieros
one
y
has
técnicos a
been
disposición de los
providing
países
financial and
miembros y
technical
empresas.
resources made available to countries and
Estamos
companies.
buscando
We
también
are
apoyar otras áreas
exploring the possibility of supporting
de
other
respuesta
areas
usando temas de recursos incluso asignados al
and
transporte, como puede ser
using resources for
reasignación de recursos
transport
que iba
and
para construcción de
reallocating
carreteras se
resources
reasignaron
to
hacia la
build,
recuperación
maybe that
de
were meant to
hospitales
build
y adaptación de
roads, were
hospitales
rechanneled to build
nuevos para atender
hospitals, new hospitals
el pico.
to be able to
Hemos
contain
apoyado con
the
liquidez
peak
también las redes de
of the
seguridad para las
pandemic.
poblaciones
Also
vulnerables,
liquidity for
trabajadores en el
vulnerable
sector informal en
populations
particular.
and
Creo
people
que
in
por ahí
the
le llegamos de
informal
manera muy
sector.
importante a
I
los
think
trabajadores del sector transporte, de ese segmento
in the
informal que he venido
transport sector
mencionando.
of that
También ha habido
informal
acciones de defensa del tejido
segment, we've
productivo
reached
y
them,
empleo
and
mediante
also
financiamiento
promote
y
employment
garantías de liquidez que
through
se han
financing
canalizado a
and
través de los
ensuring
sectores financieros
liquidity
de los
that were
países y se están
channeled through the
canalizando en este
financial
momento
channels of the different
para las
countries.
cadenas
in order
suministro más
to
estratégicas.
maintain
Y
the
lo
more
mismo por el lado
strategic
de los
supply
gobiernos, ¿no?
chains,
Políticas
and also
fiscales
the
para aliviar los impactos
government's
económicos
fiscal
que
policies
se han
to
venido
relieve
observando.
the
El banco
economic
también ha
impacts
estado
that have been observed. The
maximizando el uso
bank
de estos
has
instrumentos con los
maximized
países.
the use of these
Y eso es como
instruments
la primera
together with the
etapa, eso
countries.
está en
So this is
marcha.
the
Con
first
eso quedó
stage. This is
prácticamente
already in place,
comprometido los recursos del
and
banco del
the
2020.
resources of the
Ahora
bank
se
have
está
been
trabajando en
committed throughout
2021,
2020, and now we are
2022,
already
donde lo que
evaluating
nosotros
2021 and
vemos hacia adelante
2022.
es que se requiere
And what
aún
we
más
see
liquidez,
facing the
pero se tiene que
future is
empezar
a
a
need for
buscar
more
esa nueva
liquidity, and
recuperación y
also
aprovechar
the
esos
need
pocos
to
recursos
find
que se
new
pueden
ways
dirigir
of
a la
recovery
inversión
and try to
para que esta inversión
maximize the
sea
use
más,
of
más
those
sostenible y
resources, that
más
this is a more
focalizado
sustainable
con una
investment
agenda
and more
estimulando o
focused
apoyando
on
agendas
an
proactivas
agenda
de crecimiento sostenible,
to
con
focus on
énfasis
more
particularmente en
sustainable
temas
growth
como infraestructura sostenible, lo
in
que
terms
sea
of
mantenimiento
sustainable
de infraestructuras
infrastructure,
críticas,
maintenance
mantenimiento de
of critical
empresas
infrastructure,
fundamentales
maintenance
para
of
para
essential
el sector, pero
companies for
también
the sector.
apoyo
But
específico a cadenas
also we need
productivas como pueden ser
to focus
aquellas que
specifically
aseguran
on
o
productive
permiten
chains
la
that
seguridad alimentaria que
ensure
requieren
food
nuestros
security,
países.
of course,
Esas son
required
las
by our
tareas pendientes.
countries.
Nosotros vemos
So these
muchos
are
retos hacia
pending
adelante, pero
issues. We
también
see many challenges facing
creemos que es una
forward, but we
oportunidad y
also
no es
believe that
fácil
this is
aprovechar la
an
oportunidad
opportunity.
porque
And it's not
a
easy to
diferencia
really
de lo que
leverage this
teníamos antes de la
opportunity
pandemia,
because
hoy
as
día lo que
opposed to what
tenemos
we
es
had
muchos
before the
menos recursos
pandemic,
financieros.
today we have
Pero
fewer
creo que se puede
resources.
aprovechar esa
But I
oportunidad
think we can maximize
qué hacer si se quiere
and
para
really
focalizar más esos
seize this
recursos financieros
opportunity
hacia
to
actividades de
allocate
inversión y política
financial
pública que
resources
sean
towards
mucho más
investment and public
sostenibles.
policies
Gracias.
measures in a more sustainable manner.
Yo lo dejaría por ahí, Carolina.
Thank you very much. This is the end of my presentation. Carolina, you have the floor again.
Thank you very much, Nestor, for your presentation. I think it is very important what you have highlighted, the need to provide more liquidity to transport system, taking into account all the stakeholders in the region at a time, as you mentioned, when the availability of financial resources is scant. So from the point of view of sustainability, it's going to be a key point to understand how to align incentives, supports, and policies to be developed in the region in the next months and probably in the next years. Also, I think you've mentioned at the beginning the stages and how there's going to be an overlap between this first phase of understanding and responding to the emergency per se, trying to cure and prevent at the same time, and in the next stage, we will be able to, once we can find a cure or a vaccine, we will be able to work towards the recovery and the mitigation of impacts on our economies. Without further ado, I would like to remind the audience that you have the Q&A button available to be able to make questions, to ask questions to the panelists, and we will be reading them at the end of the presentations. Also, you can do so by using the hashtags Decarbonisation or Decarbonisation Transport Argentina in Twitter and LinkedIn in the conference group. Decarbonizing Transport Argentina is also the group available for that purpose. I will give you next the next panelist, who is John Paul Rodriguez. He is an expert and professor at Hofstra University. He has been the professor from different universities. Among other positions, Dr. Rodriguez sat on the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on the Future of Manufacturing between 2011 and 2016. In 2019, he was recipient of the Edward Ullman Award for Outstanding Contribution to the Field of Transport Geography by the American Association of Geographers. He also published widely in topics including maritime transport systems and logistics, global supply chains, and transport corridors. He was authored of 6 books, 32 books, chapters, and more. Dr. Rodriguez received his PhD from Université of Montreal. Jean-Paul, the floor is yours. Welcome to this conference.
Thank you for the introduction. So allow me, first of all, to express my thanks for the ITF for inviting me to take part in this conference. So now I'm going to share my screen and hope that everything runs smoothly. Okay. So let's begin. So in my short presentation, I'm going to be focusing on some of the challenges that we are facing right now regarding international trade in the logistics sectors. It's, I would say, quite a mitigated situation, and I'm going to provide you some little bit of evidence or data to underline how the situation currently is very nuanced and I would say divergent in some way. I'll explain what I mean by this. A little bit of a repetition. This current pandemic is not a single event. It's a succession of events, a succession of phases, and which are characterized by different shocks on supply chain. It started up with China with a demand shock. This is well known. And then we move on into, a supply shock, and then move on to a demand shock with advanced economies where we have lockdown, and then a massive wave of adaptation, mitigation strategies. And now we're entering a very disturbing phase. And again, I'm simply speculating here. I call it divergence. That is, there are places which are now moving into a post-COVID situation, where things are gradually moving to normal, but there are other locations, including, unfortunately, the United States, parts of the United States, and also developing economies, if you look at the situation in Brazil and some Latin American countries as well, that are now facing, I would say, a full-fledged re-impact or full-fledged impact of this pandemic. So you're gonna get some kind of a bipolar world for the next few months or so, in terms of places which have mitigated the situation relatively effectively and places which are struggling to deal with the situation. And this is not very conducive for international trade and international relations. It's going to create a lot of problems, and it's going to be very difficult to guess what they are, depending upon the level and extent of this divergence. Again, those figures are well known here in terms of the international trade. As far as the data currently can indicate, it's some kind of a replication of the financial crisis in terms of the level of the scale of it. That's what we have so far. So we have, but a very big difference concerning the current pandemic is it's an external shock, which means it was not linked with the system itself. It was linked with, obviously, with an external event. So if you look at this technically, you would say recovery should be very rapid because there's no, you could say, significant internal impact. But of course, what I say is not correct. What I mean by that is the external shock has created a variety of stress, a variety of impacts which have become internalized. Among them was financial, the demand, workplace, and so on and so forth. So we'll see how this is going to unfold, but it's very clear for the last decade or so, international trade was in a deflationary status process. And we'll see if this crisis is going to undermine it. So overall, I see 4 challenges because we're dealing with a crisis. The crisis is nothing new. It's not a new situation. It simply underlines the current weaknesses of the system. And there are many of them, and they are exposed, each and one of them, at the exact same time. And that's the problem of it. When you got the financial crisis a decade or so ago, it exposed the vulnerability of our financial system. But now pretty much everything is under stress. So it's a global stress test, as you can see, obviously. So it's going to create a rebalancing of supply chain. We'll see in terms of location, in terms of resilience. So that's going to be a very big topic over the coming years, is what type of supply chain we can build to include these risks. And it's going to involve the relocation of economic activity. It's going to involve duplication of supply, possibly, especially in some critical sectors, such as the pharmaceutical industry. We learned very, very harsh lessons regarding this, that efficiency is not necessarily a resilience. And so that's something we are going to have to be addressing. The third part, which is excessively confusing, is right now we're seeing a global repricing of assets, repricing of commodities. And it creates a lot, I would say, of confusion, because what used to be abundant became scarce, and what used to be scarce could become abundant. And that creates a lot of confusion. And that brings up to what I call the current reset, or the Great Reset. And I'm not very enthusiastic about the future of globalization. We have reached pre-globalization. We're going to see a setback, I would say a devolution of this process for the years to come. So allow me to go a little bit very quickly here. We all know that supply chain, a lot of what was driving a lot of them was to optimize or maximize the efficiency of non-material inputs, such as labor was very well known. But right now, with the process of automation, with the pandemic risk and resilient, it's going to probably reinforce the readjustment, possibly towards maximizing distribution and procurement efficiency, as opposed to minimizing non-material input costs. So what does it mean? Massive manufacturing, supply chain, relocation process. How far this is going to go, again, it remains to be seen. But again, you should not undermine, of course, as well, the power of the establishing industrial clusters. It's tough to declusterize something when it has happened. So don't discount China because, oh, say, oh, let's go out of China. China has many powerful manufacturing clusters. They cannot be undermined very quickly, but the trend is against that for a variety of reasons. So that's one aspect. Another aspect we have a little bit discussed so far is the variety of shocks that supply chain have been imposed upon, including supply shock themselves, the distribution shocks as well, and the demand shock as well. For instance, there was a lot of issue about hoarding. We realized that hoarding was not a problem. What was the problem is the shift in demand patterns from commercial, personal consumption away from institutional and commercial demand, which means that many supply chains that were supplying retail stores or supplying restaurants were not adapted to supply consumers. And we saw a massive substitution taking place because of that. It is something else which does not bode very well for decarbonization. Decarbonization could be the victim of its own success. And right now, the global price of many commodities, including oil, is dirt cheap. And financial assets are scarce, so pushing for a decarbonization agenda under the current circumstances will be excessively difficult because the competitiveness of the technologies are going to be eroded. And the more the technologies be imposed, the more some commodities get cheaper and the less competitive decarbonization can be. So you have to bear this in mind over the next few years or so. Because if I'm a company, why should I refurnish my fleet of truck while the price of energy is dirt cheap, while try to commit capital investment which is not available? And in a very high risk situation, as I say, good luck with that. Moving on, so here's what currently I speculate about what's currently in terms of the reset of the global economy. In terms of the workforce, and we saw a massive amount of furlough across the board. And when you reopen, corporations are asking a question, who do I hire back? And every corporation is now reassessing its labor need. And it's going to rehire based upon what is the most productive, what is the most valuable for my corporation. At the same time, you get telework, which made a lot of corporations realize, hey, I did not need that much labor. And maybe some of the work can become contracting work with the power of telework. So that's something you have to bear in mind. Another aspect is all those cascading defaults. When people stop paying, it creates a form of debt chains. If, let's say, somebody does not pay their rent, it means that a bondholder will not receive money in the end. And that creates a cascading effect, which we are just starting to see. Wait when we'll see the default taking place in real estate, in manufacturing, in let's say in retail. All of this taking place as massive amount of companies decide that the current circumstances and the amount of cash is not prone to reopening. So that's something which you have to bear in mind. And the economies that are the most oriented towards the service sector are likely to be the economies which are the most vulnerable, which is paradoxical. Everything that is highly transactional in nature that requires human-to-human interaction obviously has become excessively vulnerable. And something as well that worries me is to what extent there's a scale effect behind this. To what extent the small companies are going to be more vulnerable than larger companies. So that's something we have not found so far. So we'll find out that. We saw some indication regarding this. And in terms of discretionary demand, it's essentially gone. The retail sector has been uncompromised. Travel, tourism has disappeared at the global level. Restoration has disappeared. The cruise industry is gone for a while. So it's going to take a long time to create this, recreate this discretionary demand, which so many economies depend upon. And last and not least, this reset involves a substitution. E-commerce has gained, it's very clear, behind this. I wonder how people could have, I would say, be able to function within this pandemic without, I would say, an effective e-commerce structure. And that's create a massive surge for this. And it's going to create as well a massive surge of automation. So all of these substitution effects are going to have a very, very big impact on the global economy. And that's going to be essentially my last slide for my little intervention here is, again, are we reaching peak globalization? And in the post-COVID concept, all international agreement, trade is subject to renegotiation, to questioning. I expect a surge of protectionism. Are we trying to create a borderless world, which is fine, but now with a pandemic and other issue, borders matters. And we start to realize that. Global migration has ceased as well. So all of this is going to create a lot of mistrust in international institutions, in my opinion, for the years to come. Obviously, in terms of production, it's going to create a surge of automation, surge of reshoring, that's going to be taking place. And supply chain going to be reassessed in terms of their vulnerability, not in terms of their efficiency. That's going to be a very big risk. Transportation, as we have discussed, I expect an ongoing, continuing decline of the demand for international transportation across the board. Of course, some sectors are going to be more impacted than others, but this is going to be mitigated by a growth of e-commerce and online transaction. And last and not least, all of this is strongly deflationary. And deflation is going to continue for time to come. And all of this involves a repricing of things, revaluing what is the component of your economy. From the service sector, the manufacturing sector, all of this, everything is being, in some way, being repriced and reassessed regarding this. And with this said, that's all I have for now. I will, of course, open for question and discussion later on because I covered issues which obviously are quite controversial. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Jean-Paul, por tu presentación.
Thank you, Jean-Paul, for your presentation. I think it's very much aligned to what you've said about the impact, the cascade impact. The pandemic is an inverse cascade impacted from demand and the restrictions to supply chains and the transportation of passengers. And the payment will influence the liquidity of companies. So it exerts a higher pressure on the possibility of keeping these systems afloat. I think it is very important, and I'm sure it will mean a big challenge, and also a window of opportunity to rethink. But I think there is an important need in Latin American region, at least, to support these changes and these paths to rebalance systems in such a way that will allow us, in an inclusive manner, to keep the economy running. Next, I will introduce Gonzalo Muñoz. As I said before, he is the Chilean champion, high-level climate champion for the 25th Conference of the Parties. He has been appointed in this role as champion for the COP25. His role entails mobilizing climate action in non-state actors around the world, as well as advising the presidency of COP25. Among other ventures, Mr. Muñoz co-founded and ran Triciclos, one of the recognized Latin American companies in the circular economy, and now he's a member of Chile's National Advisory Committee of Water, Green Hydrogen and Circular Economy. Gonzalo, the floor is yours. And welcome to the conference. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much, Carolina. I'm going to share.
I believe I need Jean-Paul to stop sharing so I can start my sharing, or you, Carolina? Yeah, great. I'll share my screen if I find here it is. So, voy a hacer la presentación en castellano. Me siento más cómodo en eso, entendiendo que hoy hay traducción simultánea, pero
Given there is
muchas de las
simultaneous
láminas están en
interpretation, I'm
inglés, como
going
que también
to
sirven para el
give my
público
presentation in English, but
angloparlante.
many of the slides are written in
Muchas gracias,
English.
Carolina, por
Thank you very much,
esta
Carolina,
invitación.
for
Creo
your
que es
invitation.
tremendamente
I think
valioso
it is very
el tener la
valuable
posibilidad
to
de
have the possibility
aterrizar en lo que se
of
refiere a la Agenda Global de Acción
focusing
Climática,
on a
temas
global
que ya fueron
agenda of
debidamente
climate
tocados
change,
por Néstor y por
themes that have
Jean-Paul,
been appropriately
pero que en mi
addressed
caso
by
se
John
refiere
Paul.
fundamentalmente al rol que le compete a las
But
empresas
in
y a los
my
gobiernos
case, is the role
subnacionales.
of the role of
En ese
governments
sentido, me
and
gustaría
companies. In
empezar
that
por
sense, I
hacer
would like
ciertas
to begin
referencias a cómo
by
estábamos
focusing
antes
on the way
del
we
periodo
used to
del COVID para
be
después ir aterrizando a qué es lo
prior
que tenemos que hacer
COVID,
ahora que estamos en el
to
COVID, ¿no? Y
focus
voy a hacer algo
on
muy concreto como
nowadays in
referirme
the
a
midst of
las
COVID.
recomendaciones que
And I'm
hizo
going to focus
el
on the
equipo de
recommendations
científicos
of
que
the
trabajaron en
team
el
of
contexto de la
scientists
COP
who worked
en
on
torno a
the at
movilidad y,
COP
por
in
supuesto,
terms
al
of
entorno de las ciudades.
mobility and
Este equipo, por supuesto, me imagino que para
cities.
todos
This
es
team,
lo evidente, ya
I
tenía
think it's evident,
totalmente
already had
ancladas las propuestas en torno a la pirámide
their
invertida,
proposals
en torno a la
in
lógica
place
de
in terms
cambiar,
of the
evitar
inverted
y
pyramid,
mejorar como
in
marco
terms of
referencial
improving
de la
as a
lógica de
reference work
transporte en la
framework
ciudad. O sea, ya veníamos
the
con un
transport
empuje
logic in
que nos
cities.
estaba
So we
mostrando
had a
que
focus
debíamos
that was
enfrentar un
already
mundo en el cual, desde luego, el
giving the
transporte
idea
activo
where the
representa
world
como una
had
oportunidad fundamental para el
the
desarrollo de nuestras
opportunity
ciudades.
to focus on
Esto tiene
certain
que
means
ver
of
mucho
transport for the
también
development
con
of the
cómo
city.
nosotros
This is very much
diseñamos y
related to the way
desarrollamos
we
modelos en torno a las ciudades
design
para no solo
develop
reducir las
models for
emisiones del
cities,
transporte,
not
sino
only to
también para un
reduce
mejor uso del
carbon
territorio. Por
emissions,
supuesto,
but
estamos
for a better
hablando
use of the
de
territory.
impuesto al
Of course,
carbono
we
como
are
algo
talking
importante,
about
la
the
movilidad
carbon tax,
sustentable, la planificación
sustainable
urbana como
mobility,
una
urban
lógica clave
planning
sobre la cual
as a
debemos
key
desarrollar toda esta
logic on the
conversación.
basis of which we have to develop this
La
conversation.
motorización, perdón, el transporte público y no
Public
motorizado en el desarrollo de
in the
planes de mejora en
development
las
of
ciudades,
plans for improvements of the
mejores
city,
mecanismos y infraestructuras para el
better
funcionamiento, la
infrastructure
operación
and
y el
mechanism
financiamiento
for
de
the
transporte
financing
público.
of public
Todo lo que
transport.
tiene que ver incluso con
Everything that is
los
related
transportes más
to
cortos. Y voy pasando rápido porque
short
tampoco quiero detenerme en temas que desde luego son
length
importantes,
transport.
pero son
I'm
muy
going to
amplios de
go
repente para poder
quickly,
tocarlos en
but
profundidad en esta sesión. Quiero
it
verlos de
is,
forma
I would like to
genérica. Las nuevas
focus
tecnologías,
on
por supuesto, las
general things,
flotas
new
de bajas
technologies,
emisiones. Pero
fleet
déjenme
of
detenerme un
low
momento acá porque al
emissions.
final mucho de lo que estamos hablando tiene que
Much
ver
of what
con
we are
mejorar
talking about
nuestros modelos de
has to do
gobernanzas locales. Hay muchas
with
ciudades en Latinoamérica y en el
local
mundo, nos
governance.
encontramos con el desafío
On many
de
cities,
tener
we are
un
focusing on the
plan
challenges of
territorial mejor
having a
diseñado, desde el
territorial
inicio que
plan that is
promueva la sustentabilidad y
better
al mismo
in
tiempo que
place
reduzca
to
las
promote sustainability
inequidades.
and at the
Y
same
eso
time
viniendo además
reducing inequalities.
desde Chile,
Also,
desde la dificultad que hemos vivido, como algunos
from
otros
Chile
países
and the
también de la
difficulties
región,
we have
en materia
faced in
de una
terms
crisis
of
social que
a
nace
social crisis
en muchos
that
ámbitos de
springs
lo
in
mal que han
different
estado
spheres,
planificadas en nuestras
that springs
ciudades,
from
es
the
algo que
bad
creemos
planning
que
of our
debiera estar
cities. And I
presente
think
en
this
este
should
momento en
be
que
a
el COVID
focus
en muchos
nowadays
casos
when
también
COVID in
viene a
many
mostrarnos
cases
aún más
comes to
cómo se
show us
manifiestan esas
much
inequidades y por
more
otro
how
lado
those
nos ofrece una
inequalities are
oportunidad
manifested. So
patente a
we
través
have a
de los
very
planes de
clear
recuperación. ¿Cuánto,
opportunity
por lo tanto, en los
through
planes de
the
recuperación
recovery
podemos
channels,
poner en materia
how
de
much
promover
we can
sustentabilidad
focus
urbana y en
on
resolver
urban
inequidades?
sustainability
Si nos
and
vamos
solve
directamente a temas de
inequalities. If we
transporte, por
focus
supuesto
on
sabemos que el mundo
transportation, we
pre-COVID era
know
un
that
mundo
pre-COVID world
de
used to be
espacios
a world
crowded, ¿no?
of
Espacios
crowded
donde
spaces
la gente se aglomeraba
where
en el
people
transporte y sabemos
crowded
por lo
in
tanto que
transportation. And
esa
so we know
lógica
that that
que teníamos
logic
de
we used to
transportarnos
have
en grandes aglomeraciones es algo que
in big
definitivamente no
conglomerations is
podemos
something that we
continuar
can
por lo menos durante un tiempo y
we
quizás para
cannot have
siempre, y por lo
anymore,
tanto este
perhaps
desafío
forever.
de
So the
cómo
challenge
respetar
as to how
la
to
distancia social en el
respect the
transporte
social
público
distance
para todos quienes estamos acá pasa a ser uno de los grandes elementos
is one of the
fundamentales.
great key
Esto
elements.
implica
This
resolver un porcentaje
implies
importante que además
solving
se
an
expresan
important
en determinados
percentage
picos, ¿no? Entonces, no es
that
solo
expresses
qué hago
itself
con
in
este exceso
certain
de
peaks. Not
demanda
only
sobre
what
el
I
sistema,
do
sino que
in over
también
demand,
cómo
but
hago
also
para trabajar
how
sobre la misma lógica que
can
hemos
I
trabajado
work
como sociedad
on
en
the
materia del
same
COVID,
logic
en
as we
cuanto
have
a
worked
aplanar
in
ciertas
terms
curvas, a
of
disminuir esos picos.
flattening certain curves and
Entonces,
diminishing those
¿cómo
peaks?
vamos a hacer para manejar esos viajes que ya no entran en los buses y en los trenes? ¿Podemos incrementar la oferta o si
How
eso no es
will we
suficiente, qué van a hacer esos
improve this
pasajeros?
in
¿Será que
trains,
no
and
van a viajar?
how
¿Será que
will
van a
we improve the lives
potencialmente
of those
cambiar las horas? ¿Cuánto
passengers?
pueden
Will they
hacer
change their
los
hours?
empleadores
What can be
fundamentalmente,
done
o los
in
colegios,
that
las
sense?
universidades, los
Schools,
espacios de destino,
universities,
para modificar y
and
ayudar a aplanar
in
esa
order
curva de
to
transporte?
modify
Lo
and
que tenemos que
flatten that
evitar a toda
transportation
costa es
curve.
que
What
esos
we need
viajes
to
se nos
avoid
vayan a los vehículos
is
particulares, porque eso
for
sería
people to
realmente un
resort to their
drama en
personal
una serie de
vehicles,
dimensiones.
because that
Estamos
would
viendo, por
affect many
supuesto,
dimensions. We are
cómo
also
la
seeing
combinación
how
de
the
la bicicleta con el
combination of
transporte público se está
bicycles and
presentando
public
como una gran
transportation is
oportunidad que no solo tiene que
presenting
ver
an
con
important
cambiar
opportunity. This
rápidamente
not
o
only has
acelerar
to
procesos
do with
necesarios de cambio
changing
de
or
hábitos en
expediting
materia de
necessary
transporte,
changes
sino que
in
también como una
transportation
extraordinaria
habits, but
oportunidad de
also
implementación
presents
y
a
uso de los
very
planes de
interesting
recuperación, toda vez que
opportunity
además en muchos casos,
when
como lo de las
applying
ciclovías,
recovery
son
plans,
oportunidades
such as
de
maybe bicycle
generación de
paths. And this is
empleo
the
y
opportunity to create
oportunidad de cambio de
employment and
infraestructura
also make
que se puede
changes in the
testear
infrastructure.
rápido, ¿no? Yo creo que aquí
And this
entra la
can be
lógica del
easily
failing fast.
tested, and that's
Y por
where the
supuesto,
failing fast
en
logic
esa misma
comes into
lógica,
play.
el poder
Within the same
proponer
logic,
soluciones como lo
the
que
idea
está
of
proponiendo la
proposing
alcaldesa
solutions
Hidalgo de
such as
ciudades de 15
Mayor
minutos y ver cuánto podemos
Hidalgo,
reorganizar las ciudades
these 15
para
minutes rules, and
favorecer el
how we
que
can
un modelo
reorganize
de
cities
transporte como el de la
to favor
bicicleta
a transportation
y la
model
caminata
such as the
funcionen,
use of
creemos que es
bicycle, the use of
fundamental. Entonces, de
walking. I
alguna
believe
forma
this
hoy
is an
estamos también
essential
necesariamente
aspect.
desde la agenda de
I
los
think that
champions, buscando
today,
demostrar cómo tenemos una
within the
oportunidad
agenda of
única para
champions, we have to
devolverle
find this
espacios
unique
a los medios
opportunity
sustentables de
to
transporte, un espacio que
give a
durante
new
el último
role to
siglo le hemos estado
sustainable
dando
methods of
al vehículo particular. Aquí
transportation
tenemos una
and
lámina muy simple,
defavor the
digamos, de
use
cómo
of
un
personal
espacio vial
vehicles.
puede
This is
cambiar
a
rápidamente si es que
simple
le damos
outline of
una de
how the
las vías
scenario can change
a la
if we
bicicleta
give a
y cómo
lane to
eso
bicycles,
potencialmente acelera
and how that can
fundamentalmente la cantidad de
potentially
pasajeros por hora que podemos transportar.
accelerate or increase
En ese
the number of
sentido, mucho de lo que
passengers
hemos
that we can
aprendido tiene que
transport.
ver
In
con
this sense,
cuánto
much of
podemos
what we've
hacer
learned has to
para
do with
que las
how
personas
much
viajen
we
menos.
can
Ese
do for
mundo
people
se
to
nos ha
travel
presentado, por
less.
supuesto, de forma
This
dolorosa, pero
world
todos nosotros
has
potencialmente, creo
opened
yo,
up
nos hemos
in a
transportado
very
mucho menos durante este
accelerated
periodo.
manner, but
Pero
during this
también cuánto
period, we've
podemos
traveled
promover a través
much
del
less.
diseño,
But
menos
we also have
distancias
to
por
think
cada
how
viaje.
much we can
Y ahí
promote
empiezan las lógicas también
shorter
energéticas y
distances per
medioambientales desde el punto de vista de las
travel and
emisiones, ¿no?
also
¿Cuánto
less
podemos
travels per person.
usar
Also from
menos
the point of
energía
view
por
of
kilómetro por
emissions, how
pasajero?
can we
¿Cuánto
use
podemos emitir
less
menos CO2 por cada
CO2
unidad de
emissions
energía que
per
utilicemos?
unit
Yo
of
creo que es el
energy that
momento
we
de
use?
plantearnos todas ellas y
I
no
think
solo
this is
concentrarnos en
important to
una.
consider
Es
and not
importante que
just
tengamos
focus
una
on
visión
one.
que
We have to
contemple cada
focus
una
on
de las
all
cuatro
of them
decisiones.
with a holistic
Desde los
vision
Champions, nosotros
and
operamos desde el año 2015 en
considering
una
all these
plataforma
aspects.
que se llama
Since
el Marrakech Partnership
2015, we have a
y
platform
en
called the
global, en la Global
Marrakesh
Climate Action
Partnership within
Agenda,
the
en 9
Global
áreas
Climate Action
temáticas, más
Agenda.
bien 7 áreas temáticas y
And it has
2
7 thematic
transversales.
areas,
Dentro de las 7 áreas temáticas
cross-cutting
está
areas.
asentamientos
Within
humanos y
these 7
transporte como
thematic
dos
areas, we
fundamentales,
have
y dentro de
human
ello
settlements and
con
transport
Nigel
as
este
the two
año,
essential ones. And
Nigel Topping,
together
el
with
champion de la
Nigel this year,
COP26 del
is the
Reino Unido,
champion in
estamos trabajando en
COP26 in
una
the United
serie
Kingdom.
de
We are
lo que llamamos
working
nosotros
on
procesos
a
de mapas
series
sistémicos
of
de transformación,
processes and systemic
entre los cuales está,
transformation
por
maps.
supuesto, el fin del motor de
Included
combustión
in this,
interna, por
we have the
supuesto,
end of
mejor
internal
infraestructura
combustion, better
y mejor
infrastructure, and
funcionamiento
of
de las
course,
ciudades.
better
En cada uno
functioning
de
of
estos
cities as a
subtemas que
whole.
coloco ahí, estamos
Each of
trabajando
these
con un equipo amplio
subtopics
que nos está
is
apoyando en
being worked
desarrollar
on,
los
and
mapas
we're
de
receiving a
transformación
lot of
sistémica.
support to develop
Y
systemic
esos mapas de
transformation
transformación
maps.
sistémica vienen a
These
contribuir
systemic
a lo que el
transformation
año
maps
pasado presentamos
are a
como los
contribution
1.5
to what we
Pathways.
presented
Cada una de las
last
áreas temáticas,
year, which are
incluyendo
the
el área
milestones
temática de
towards
transporte
2050.
desarrolló una
This is in
herramienta
the issue of
llamada el One
Transport,
1.5
and we
pathways hacia
developed
los 1,5
a
grados
tool
en el
called
área de transporte,
1.5
donde
pathways,
colocan ciertos milestones
and
fundamentales. Estos
certain
pathways hoy en día
milestones
los
were set
estamos
out, especially in
perfeccionando y
these pathways. This
profundizando
is being,
para
of course,
terminar, ojalá
perfected
este
in
año con una
order
nueva
to
versión de
finish,
ellos
hopefully
y
this
llegar
year,
el
with a new
próximo año a
version,
Glasgow, a la
and
COP21,
maybe
un
next
elemento
year
cada vez más
get
sólido, muy bien
to
validado
the
por la
Conference of the
ciencia, donde
Parties
podamos
with
mirar
a
incluso
science-based
distintos
document that
ámbitos de
will
relación
focus
entre
on
los
the
diversos
different
1.5 pathways.
aspects of the
Esto no los quiero,
1.5
digamos,
pathways.
enredar con
I do
en
not
general
want to
cómo
bore
están
you
estructurados, pero los
with
invito a que
this
revisen
long
los
text, but
pathways y por
I
supuesto
encourage you
nos
to check
acompañen y
out
nos
the
contribuyan. Hoy en día
pathways.
una de las cosas que estamos haciendo con Nigel
One of the
es un
things that
proceso de
we are doing
feedback
with
para
NIGEL is a
perfeccionar el
feedback
funcionamiento
process
del
to
Marrakech Partnership. Sería
improve the
muy bueno
functioning
tener, por
of the
supuesto,
market
contribuciones de
partnership.
quienes están
And it would be
escuchando en la
very good
sala,
to have
ya
the
sea en materia de
contributions of
transporte, en materia
those of
de
you listening
ciudades,
today
gobierno subnacional,
in
etcétera.
terms
En
of
cualquiera de los
cities,
ámbitos necesitamos, por
subnational
supuesto,
governments, and
voces
in
expertas que
all
nos
the
puedan
areas, of
acompañar.
course, we need expert
Y uno de
voices
los
to
resultados
support us.
importantes que
One of
nosotros
the
hemos
important
desarrollado,
results that
además de,
we've
como les decía,
developed along
los 1.5
with
pathways
the 1.5
y los
pathways
transformation
and
maps,
the
es el
transformation
agrupar
maps is
a nivel
the
global todos aquellos actores no
grouping
estatales,
of
como decía antes,
all
empresas,
non-state
pueden ser ciudades,
stakeholders such
gobiernos
as
subnacionales a modo
cities,
de regiones,
companies, national
inversionistas,
governments,
sociedad civil, universidades,
investors, the civil
que estén
society, the
comprometidos con la
academic
carbono
sector,
neutralidad
all
como
of those that
máximo
are
al
committed
2050.
to carbon
Esa
neutrality
alianza que se llama la Climate Ambition
between
Alliance
now and
hoy tiene una campaña que se
2050.
llama
This
Race to
Climate
Zero,
Ambition
donde
Alliance
estamos
has a
invitando
campaign
a sumar
called
todo tipo de
Race to
voces
Zero,
para
and we
acelerar un
invite
proceso
all
hacia construir
walks of
ese
life to
mundo
join
resiliente y
this
carbono neutral antes del
initiative and to build
2050 y en
this
este caso
resilient
desde el
world
rol que
in
nos compete a los actores no
2050. In
estatales.
this
Estamos en un
case,
momento crítico,
from the perspective
necesitamos
of
que
state
todos quienes
actors.
entendemos la gravedad del
We
problema y
need to
entendemos que hoy
understand the
tenemos una
severity of the
herramienta
problem, and
fundamental
we also
basada en la
need to understand
carbono
that we have
neutralidad
a
antes del
fundamental
2050,
tool
se
to reach
comprometan y
carbon
puedan
neutrality
participar en este
before
caso a través de
2050,
Race
and
to
we
Zero.
need
Entonces,
everyone's
invito
commitment, in
a
this
quienes
case,
están en la
to
sala, ya sea desde
through
su
the
rol
Race
como
to
gobiernos
Zero
subnacionales o su rol como
initiative. In
personalidades
your
del transporte,
roles
universidades,
as
que se puedan sumar
important
a esta
figures within the
alianza.
transport sector
Muchísimas
or
gracias,
in
Carolina.
any
Un gusto de
capacity,
poder
I
seguir
invite you and
participando con
encourage you
ustedes.
to join us. Thank you, Carolina, for inviting me. Thank you, Jean-Paul, for your presentation. I think that your presentation also resonates and has to do with a lot of things that were mentioned before, in the sense that this is an opportunity to understand that the decisions that we make in the next few months or years have to be aligned with sustainability and aligned with a low emission development. I think that one thing you said is very important, and it's this opportunity to rethink governance systems, because at the end of the day, I believe personally that everything that has to do with development and with governance within these forums are extremely important, and it's where the actions materialize in the end. Finally, the importance of certain tools such as the pathways and all the tools that are being developed from your organization, all organizations participating in the COP. Of course, also all stakeholders are important, and I think what you mentioned in terms of the involvement and the participation of all stakeholders, not just governments, is essential to really promote ownership of this agenda. Having said this, I will introduce our last, but not least for that, our last panelist is Jose Barbero. This is his bio. He is a transport planning and policy specialist with extensive experience in Argentina and Latin America. He has worked as a public official in Argentina, as well as in multilateral organizations, in transport companies. He's worked as a consultant and in the academic field. He is currently the Dean of the Transportation Institute of the National University of San Martin. Jose, you have the floor. Welcome to this virtual stage, and the microphone and the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Carolina. Lo primero que voy a
Thank you
hacer
very much, Carolina. The first thing that I will do is share my screen, as we've all done. Above all, I would like to thank the International Transport Forum. I truly appreciate their work. The ITF was born 15 years ago, and there wasn't an organization before that that could see transport from a global perspective. So for me, it is an honor really to participate in an event organized by the ITF. The topic is very far-reaching, but I will focus more on freight than on passenger transport, and also focusing more on Latin America and Argentina specifically. One way of understanding freight transport at a regional level has to do with understanding interurban freight transport in Latin America. You can see here 6 pie charts for 6 different countries, and you can see the significant contribution of motor transport and the role of railways, which is relevant only in 2 countries. In Brazil, mostly related to the transport of minerals, and in Mexico, with its connection with the north. Navigation of maritime transports has relevance in certain countries, but it's connected to the transportation of hydrocarbons for maritime transport. This is for interurban. If we add to this freight transport at an urban level, which is exclusively done through motor transport, these percentages would be further enhanced. In Argentina, specifically for passenger transport, interurban passenger transport accounts for 90% of automotive transport. Train and plane are not as relevant. And for passenger transport, except in the metropolitan area where 10% is railway or the metro system, the rest is individual transport and public transportation, motor transport specifically. So this matrix in our transportation that is so highly focused on the motor transport, obviously is related to the consumption of fuel. 80% in Argentina comes from fossil fuels. Gas has significant relevance, more than the world average, and also biofuels that have grown in the past few years. Of course, fossil fuels of course reflect in emissions, which you see on the right. They have grown, maybe not so much in the last years, but the country did not grow in the last few years. So when the economy stagnates, so does the use of fuel. If you consider the consumption of fuels and emissions together with other elements such as the strong motorization of society, the growing trend towards individual vehicle transport, I would say that this started at the beginning of the century. Just to define the beginning of this trend, it's where we reached more consensus in the sense of changing this paradigm. Civil society, NGOs, and the academic sector started promoting this trend. Slowly, the government started adopting this, mostly subnational at the beginning, and then later on, the national governments began adopting and consolidating this change of paradigm. Actually, countries in Latin America in 2015 signed the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, subscribed to these initiatives with a stronger focus on the environment, not so strongly focused on social problems or problems of access related to mobility, gender problems, etc., which are very relevant, were important. Also, economic and financial sustainability issues were not as widespread before COVID. The problems of financial sustainability of public transportation in Latin America was a major problem before this. The emphasis on the urban world and what could be done in the urban world was stronger and not so much on freight. But we've observed that freight transport has a potential for reduction, and there is a change of paradigm that is necessary in this sense. This was reflected, among other things, in national contributions of Latin American countries. They might not be sufficient right now, and they will be adjusted over the next few years. From the point of view of transport, I would say there is good news because national contributions have a strong presence of transport projects. And this is good news because the previous mechanism, which was the Kyoto Protocol, had no or virtually no transport focused projects. And now we are starting to observe them in this new context. Obviously, there's bad news as well. And this involves the fact that the proposals of modification of the transport sector are not so based on consent or agreed upon initiatives within the state level, but more environmental projects from that sector, from the environmental sector specifically. And I will explain this further. One could say that if we could look back and maybe think about the beginning of this year or last year, the general situation in the region was that ahead of us, we saw a change of paradigm, growing consensus for this change of paradigm, a change in the model of freight transportation, passenger transport, and that's where we were when this COVID-19 pandemic hit us. The short-term impact was very strong, but it has been already mentioned and described. But what we need to think about is that when this is in the past, what the world will look like. It's difficult to predict. There are many things that are uncertain. We can anticipate what type of impact we will see, maybe the scope or the timing, but some things are, of course, more difficult to predict. Undoubtedly, it will leave a lot of consequences in all sectors. Some of the consequences might be favorable. For example, the digitalization, the possibility of traveling less or traveling shorter distances, different services, shorter supply chains. These are probably positive impacts of the pandemic that might favor this road towards the new paradigm. But we will also see negative consequences, and this is for sure a problem that we need to deal with. One of them is the fear of people resorting to their individual vehicles at a greater level. This is a problem in Latin America in the sense which are motorcycles. The use of motorcycles has grown significantly in Latin American countries in the past years, and the probability of having a fatal accident on a motorcycle is approximately 20 times higher than having an accident in a car. So the massive use of motorcycles, if it is not handled carefully, can be very dangerous. I think other topics have been already discussed. Because the repricing of hydrocarbons that Jean-Paul mentioned, and the risk, of course, of building a transportation company that takes a lot of time, a lot of efforts, a lot of human resources that have to work properly. So this situation can cause many problems and destroy values and social capital. So that has to be considered as well. I think that an important thing to consider is that we need to have a recovery agenda, an agenda that is aligned and that does not neglect in the search for economic recovery, does not neglect those changes that we were already implementing towards a more sustainable form of transport. If I look at Argentina, the context will be extremely harsh. extremely harsh because of the drop in income, the growing unemployment, growing poverty levels, difficulties to obtain credit and financing. It will be a really complex scenario. Undoubtedly is how to combine certain economic reactivation measure and employment promotion to relieve the social problems, but also combine it with cleaner and more resilient forms of transport. This can happen, but this involves an important requirement, and it is the following. These transport policies must include from the get-go different sectors. For example, it is different to think of a transport policy towards the future that does not include energy policies, environmental policies, productive development policies, and urban and habitat development policies as well. So this today appears with more clarity than ever before, even though we knew about it. Today it is clearer than ever. And this goes against sometimes certain institutional organizations where the state works in a very spread out way. So it's hard to centralize and discuss initiatives with common goals. So I think there is a conceptual difficulty in identifying the measures, but there's also an institutional deficiency to organize, define them, and implement them in an efficient manner. I would like to close my presentation by focusing on certain priorities with these criteria and developing systems that will contribute to growth. Imports in Argentina will be essential for this growth, and they have to be compatible with sustainable development. And of course, must be focused on building more resilient systems. Climate change and mitigation are issues that we deal with, but also this has a strong influence in the transport sector. So I propose 5 priorities that you see on the screen, and there is not one measure to save them all. Yes, there are 5 important measures that I believe must be implemented. Everything that it can be done with freight transport, automotive freight transport is very important, because even if we have a shift towards railways, etc., trucks will always have a very important role in our economy, and there has to be a change there. It can have to do with the fuel or with more efficient operations, or the technology that offers today many opportunities to work in this sector. In terms of the modal change in Argentina with significant freight transport, the railways should have a more important role than it has today. This is not easy. It involves a lot of regulatory changes, but I believe that that is a potential that we need to leverage. Maritime transport is also important. Here we have more regulatory problems that need to be addressed. Also, the river transport is very important, and that connectivity through waterways is a challenge that must be faced. I think here there is a lot of problems that need to be addressed with the rainfall, with the level of the water of the Paraná River, especially here in Argentina, and of course import exports in the Buenos Aires area. I think there are challenges and decisions need to be made in this sense. And logistics related operations need to improve significantly. Small logistics firms are very important. They have a possibility of organizing, but I think this focuses more on large logistics operations that need to make better use of the equipment and have a more efficient operation. Finally, an important aspect, which is the fact that in Argentina, we have a lot of trade that is done through roads with neighboring countries, with Chile, especially, etc. So border crossings, which are critical points with significant major delays, would really benefit from an improvement, of course, in the infrastructure, for sure, but also making processes more agile, avoiding delays and misuse of the equipment. I think this problem needs to be addressed as well. So that is my message. And I think that there is a need to move forward with integrated strategies between transport policies and other public policies. Of course, probably one of the challenges in Chile is to harmonize public policies, having received maybe institutions that are better prepared to deal with these objectives. Now, these objectives have to be combined. That is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose, for your presentation. I think there are very many messages aligned today, and I think it's very important what you mentioned at the beginning as to the matrix, transportation matrix in Argentina, and how that is aligned to the energy matrix Minister Meoni mentioned at the beginning. And focusing on your presentation, the integration of the different sectors to tackle these challenges jointly. I think this is a key point. I would also like to highlight that you have also mentioned in other presentations the shocks in supply and demand in this pandemic period. But there are other positive aspects. For example, there have been certain changes that could be put to good use as if we consider them as part of the measures forward. I will close this session now to give room for the Q&A section. The exchange with participants is the richest part sometimes. I'm going to excuse Gonzalo Munoz. He had to leave due to other prior commitments, but if there are questions addressed to him, we are going to invite him to answer them in the different social media using the hashtag. I will begin with some of the questions that I consider quite relevant in terms of what's been discussed. This one is perhaps a bit general. I'm going to ask Nestor. We know that the decarbonizing agenda has been quite costly so far. It implies great investment, especially the initial investment for the restructuring and reconversion of vehicles. How do you think, from the bank focus point of view and other multilateral organisms, how do you think that this is going to take place after the pandemic to have a better access to funding and to implementing this when we consider higher economic and financial pressure? Thank you, Carolina. I think that we have to acknowledge the limits of fiscal resources of each country. This is a principle that before the COVID-19 was already an issue. We had this sort of rigid investment with certain assets from the past that we were not able to fully develop, such as roads. And we already had a restriction to take that step and to become, to get the infrastructure. Today, those challenges are even more notable. So I think it is important to take that into account. What does it remain? I think that it is not possible for countries. We do not have a real dimension of investment of the of
Lo que
structure,
queda
it will be
nos
important.
fuerza mucho a ser muy eficientes y eficaces. Y
It
creemos que esa infraestructura se debe
makes
dirigir
us
primero
become
aquellos
much more
áreas
efficient. We
donde
have to
más
address structures
sostenibilidad o
in
más
those areas where there is a higher need for
posicionamiento
more
hacia un futuro más
sustainability
sostenible,
toward a more
por decir
sustainable
algo,
future.
preferible hacer una inversión
It is best
en
to focus
mantenimiento
on
de
maintenance
ferrocarriles, donde ahí
of
modos en
railway
competencia, como mencionaba
lines,
José hace un momento,
as
conocen
Jose
mucho los países,
mentioned,
frente a un proceso de inversión
in the
pública en
face of
expansión de una red
public
vial. Ese es el
investment
tipo de cosas que vamos a tener que
on
ver siempre
different
con muy pocos
means.
recursos. Lo siguiente es cómo
Next
maximizo esos
is
recursos, ¿no? Entonces
how
hay
to
un rol
maximize
muy importante de
resources.
movilización de recursos del sector privado.
There is an important
Todos
mobilization from
sabemos,
the private
creo que en
sector.
este
We all
grupo, en
know,
este panel y en esta audiencia
in this panel at
no tenemos que
least,
convencernos mucho de
we
que
do
cuando
not
yo hago
have to
inversiones
convince
en
ourselves that when
sostenibilidad en
I
general voy a
invest
tener
in
mayores eficiencias, incluso
sustainability,
más
I will
utilidades
have
en
higher
un plazo probablemente
efficiencies
más largo que el
in
usual que usualmente reconocen los
longer
mercados de
term than
capitales. Yo
usual.
creo que ese es el tipo de
I think
inversiones que nosotros,
this
de
is the type of
inversionistas que nosotros debemos
investment
tratar de canalizar y apalancar
we
los
should
recursos
channel
públicos
and leverage
para
public
atraer
resources
esos recursos de sector
to
privado
attract
dirigidos a
those
inversión en infraestructura
investments from the
o
private sector to
servicios que
invest in
pueden
structures and
retardar la
services
necesidad de esa
that could
infraestructura. Y aquí ya estamos
delay
hablando de
the need for a
tecnología, aquí
higher
estamos hablando de una
structure.
gran
We are talking
cantidad de
about
aspectos que pueden
a
aumentar
high
la eficiencia del
amount
uso de
of
la
different
infraestructura
aspects that can
existente y sobre
improve
esa base
the
aprovechar
existing
los
structure
fondos
and
climáticos
thus
que ya
make the
existen, ¿no?
most
Que
of
también
funds and
permitirían
existing
ayudarnos a
structures that would
apalancar todo esto.
allow
Creo que
us to leverage all that.
ese es
I
el cambio.
think
Desafortunadamente
that
no
is
es que
the
vaya a ser más
change. It's not
fácil,
that
yo creo que va a ser
it's
más
going to be
difícil de
any
hacer,
easier. I think it's even
pero
going to be harder.
precisamente
But it is
eh,
precisely
yo entiendo que muchas de las maravillosas
because I understand
recetas
that
de comida
many
que
of
tenemos en
the
nuestros países para hacer
wonderful food recipes
algo
that we
muy
have in
difícil,
our
un poco
countries
más
to make
amigable en la discusión,
something friendlier in
recetas
our discussion.
de Colombia, de España,
Recipes
de
from
muchos de estos
Colombia,
países
Spain, and
vienen
many of
de
these
momentos de
countries
crisis y
come
las
from
mejores
times of
comidas han
crisis.
surgido
And the
cuando la
best
gente se pone a
food
pensar porque no tiene recursos. Yo creo que eso es lo que
start
tenemos que apalancar y
are
el BID está
developed,
muy
the
enfocado
best meals
en
are
tratar de
developed
canalizar
when
todo
we
ese
do not
esfuerzo
have
de
enough
innovación de
resources.
los
So we
sectores
have
público,
to
privado
channel
y
on
sociedad
those
civil hacia esta
innovation
nueva
processes from
realidad.
the
Pero creo que
public
nos
and
tiene
private
que quedar
sector.
muy
But I
claro
think we have to
que hay unos
be
problemas
very
fiscales
clear that
enormes,
there
¿no?
are
Y
huge
no
fiscal
alcanza los
problems.
trillones de
It is
dólares ni siquiera en
not
los
enough
países
to have all the
desarrollados
billions of dollars
para solventar lo que hacíamos antes.
to
Ese escenario ya no
finance
existe.
what we
Como
used to
diría
do.
uno en inglés, we have to move on en un
We have
escenario
to move
mucho más
on
restringido de
in
recursos
a
financieros, pero
much
totalmente amplio
restricted
en potenciales de
scenario,
innovación, tecnología
but with a
y
potential for
creatividad, ¿no?
innovation
Y
on
con una demostración clara, ¿no?
technology, with a
De lo que se
clear
puede hacer
focus on what
cuando
can be
los
done
modos de transporte se utilizan
when
o
modes of
se dejan de
transport are
utilizar
used
cuando
or
no es
are
eficiente
no
utilizar.
longer used. Thank you, Nestor. And as a follow-up, perhaps I can invite later John Paul or Jose to comment on this, but you talked about leveraging and synergize resources that come from the public as well as the private sector. So how do you think that can be consolidated in terms of dialogue and trust from the private sector in order to increase better public-private partnership
Yo
to
creo que en general,
finance
y esto ya venía
actions?
pasando
I
desde
think
antes, por lo
this
menos en el
started
banco,
happening before
los que hemos
when
trabajado en el sector público sabemos que
those of
en el
us who
pasado,
worked
por
in the
ejemplo, la
public sector
relación del
know that in the
sector
past,
público con el sector privado era
the
muy lejana, ¿no?
public-private
Era
partnership
en el
was
mejor de los casos a
far.
través de un contrato
In the best
de
of
lo que
cases,
fuera, ¿no?
is
De
by
obra,
means
de
of an
concesión,
agreement, of
muy prescrito, muy
service agreement.
definida.
It's something
Yo
very
creo que se
well
requiere
defined.
pasar a
And I
relaciones un
think
poco
we have
más
to
cercanas, más de
pass
largo plazo,
to
más de
closer
colaboración entre
relations,
sectores
to more
público y
collaborative
privado. Creo que ese es un cambio
relations
grande que
between both
tenemos que
sectors. I
hacer desde
think
el
that's
punto
a
de
big
vista de la política
change we have
pública.
to focus on. Thank you very much. Jose he would like to add something. Yes. I share with Nestor that there is a higher proximity between the private and public sectors privates are operators of traditional transportation, but in the last decades, they also participate in very strong, very hefty investments, airports, structures, high-intensity roads. I think that when we have a crisis such as this, it is very complicated to articulate public-private systems. In 2002, when we had a very deep economic crisis, at that time, the transport of passengers and highways and airports was 20% lower. Now there's much more. So a private person who has made an investment, when has to recover the investment and the number of users lower a lot, well, how is he going to go about it? So we have to rethink all contracts. I would strongly wish for the possibility of using private resources when it's abundant, with where the public sector will have a scarcity of resources. But we will have to see the mechanisms that will allow us in the future. I think that in these circumstances, it's going to be even more difficult. Thank you, Jose, for your contribution and your clarification. Now I will continue with a question for Jean-Paul. I'm going to read it in English so as not to get lost in translation.
If the service sector is going to be more affected, not so much bulk and commodities, does this mean economies that are producers or exporters of commodities can have an opportunity like Argentina? And how this trend can be impacted from deglobalization?
Yes, that's a complex, I would say, issue. What I can imagine at this point is the fact, and again, it's going to be a mutual negative reinforcement cycle, is the high service economies are at the same time the high demand economies, such as North America and Europe. So therefore, if the service sector is deeply impacted, the economies that are exporting resources, again, it depends on the type of resource. I don't think the agri sector is going to be as impacted as, let's say, mineral products, or you could say the energy sector are going to be also negatively impacted as well. So that's my concern, is the driver would be the vulnerability of service-oriented economy that are going to undertake a massive restructuring of their labor composition because of the pandemic. And also one of my biggest fear is, I start to observe it, is the growing cognitive dissonance between the public sector, which has its goal and aspirations, and the economic reality, which is different. And you push for an agenda which does not necessarily reflect the emerging reality, which is taking place, let's say, within metropolitan areas, within economic sectors. So that's one of my concern. And also it's exacerbated the fact we don't know at this point what this new reality is. So tread carefully with your agendas. Be very careful, because this reality is unfolding as we speak. So that's, again, that's the best I can say at this point in time.
Muchas gracias, Jean-Paul, por tu intervención. Quisiera saber si...
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul, for your intervention. Perhaps Nestor or Jose would like to add something? If not, we will continue with the next question.
A mí me gustaría...
I would like to go back to what Nestor mentioned in his presentation with reference to, I mean, he mentioned that he should take an advantage of the contingency, and this is somewhat aligned to the question, be it from the point of view of generating these changes from the technical point of view, from the logistic and structures, but also institutional and regulatory changes in order to strengthen the system as a whole. And in that sense, one of the things that we were wondering about are the regulatory and governance changes take a lot of time because it involves a lot of red tape and agreements that are not so swift. So how do you think we can somehow dynamize those processes at a time when we need to take faster action so that these changes can be operated on faster than the possibility to going back to business as usual, as to the way we used to move about prior to the pandemic?
Bueno, yo creo que, la oportunidad
I
de,
think
que
that
estamos viendo hoy día,
the opportunity we are seeing
digamos
nowadays
que hay una prueba fehaciente de todo lo que han logrado hacer
is
muchas de las ciudades y países en
proof
reacción
of
a la pandemia
what
como
many
tal,
countries and cities were
en
able
capacidad
to
regulatoria,
do
¿no? Y de
in terms
atender
of
unas fallas estructurales que han
regulatory
ocurrido
capacities
en
and
los
to
mercados,
address
¿no? Hay países que han
structural
logrado en
failures.
alguna
There are
medida
countries that have somehow
subsanar la falencia que tuvo el
succeeded
sector
in
financiero para atender ciertas necesidades del consumo. Eso es algo que en muy
mending,
poco
so as to
tiempo
speak, the financial sector. This
lo
is something
lograron
that
hacer,
was
¿no? Y creo que
achieved
fue
in a short
como que
period
se
of
generó un
time.
efecto de
And this
cooperación entre los
generated a
diferentes agentes
cooperation effect
de la política pública y de la economía
in public
política
policies and
de estas
the
decisiones que llevó
political economy
a tomar acciones fundamentales que en
that
muchos
led
casos
us to take
han
key
mantenido incluso muy
actions
controlada
that kept everything very
la
much
expansión
closely focused
de la
on
infección del virus,
in
¿no?
order to prevent
No es
the spread of
fácil
the
simular
virus. It is not
a
easy to
futuro ese
simulate
comportamiento.
that behavior
Desafortunadamente,
in the
yo creo que a
future.
medida que pasen los meses,
Unfortunately, I think that as
las semanas
months
que son
go
como meses
by
y que es
and
parte
weeks that
del tema,
seem
¿no? Cuando
like
yo tengo que
months,
hacer algo tan rápido,
when
las agentes
we
públicas se
have to
mueven
tackle
muy rápido. Yo
things,
pensaría que
we
el
have to move
tema es
swiftly. I think
actuar y promover muy rápido, ¿no?
the
Que todos
question
los
is
stakeholders
acting
que
and
tenemos algo que ver en este
promoting
tema,
things
nos movamos lo
quickly
más rápido que
so that
podamos
all
para
stakeholders
darle
can move as
herramientas a quien
swiftly as
corresponda
possible
tomar la decisión, bien sea alguien de sociedad civil, bien sea una
to take
multilateral como nosotros.
fast actions.
Nosotros, y creo que la tecnología
And I think
es un
technology
tema que puede ayudar mucho en esto, porque la
can
tecnología
be
de alguna
quite
manera es
helpful
innovación, no
because
está muy
somehow it
regulada,
means
puede definir
innovation.
nuevas realidades, de
It
hecho
can
lo hemos visto en
define
otras
new
industrias.
realities. In fact, we've seen in
Yo
other
creo
industries
que buscar
that.
esas
And I
respuestas en
think
ese tipo
that to seek
de actividades nuevas,
that type of
más que en las
response from
actividades del
new
pasado,
activities more
puede generar
rather than activities
mantener
from
esa
the past
dinámica, ¿no? Que
can
desafortunadamente
keep
yo creo que va a ir
that
bajando, ¿no? Como todo en el
dynamic, and I
mundo,
will see
yo creo
that
que nos
going
vamos a ir
down.
acomodando.
We will
Eh,
start,
Uno siente eso mismo, las burocracias
accommodating
vuelven, ¿no? O sea,
ourselves.
la burocracia en un momento dado
You feel that
desapareció
red tape
por sustracción de materia.
disappeared
Nos tomó a todos
at a
mucho tiempo,
certain
por ejemplo,
point.
poder
It
hacer estos
takes
eventos que hoy día se
us
hacen con una
a lot
eficiencia
of time
única. Por ejemplo, un evento como este.
make to organize events such as
Me temo que
these.
con el tiempo, poco a
And
poco,
I
nos vamos
think
a
that
inventar
with time,
procesos y
little by little, we
procedimientos,
will find
y por
ourselves
eso es que hay
in
que ser
procedures,
muy
in different
rápidos en
procedures. And
actuar en
so we
estos
have to
primeros
act
meses que van a
quickly
venir los
in these
próximos 5
first
años. Y
months
esos 5
that are
años van a
going
ser
to lead to
cruciales
the
para el
next
próximo
5
3
years.
decenios.
And
Creo
those
que es
5 years are going to
un
be
enfoque de
crucial.
ese estilo que
I
todos
think
individualmente
it's a
deberíamos
focus
impulsar
that
desde el
we are
interior de
all
nuestras organizaciones. Y
individually
en el
have
BID nosotros lo estamos tratando de
focused
hacer.
on. And at IDB, we are focusing on that as well. Thank you, Nestor. Next, I will focus on a question with Jose. I'm going to read it in English.
Do you think that centralizing services will have a more positive impact post-COVID? Will this lead to or require measures that penalize carbon-intensive options for cross-subsidizing?
Bueno, entiendo por centralización o descentralización.
I understand as decentralizing that decision making are focused on subnational levels. That's the way at least I understand the question. When we talk about the state in general, we have assumed the federal state, and in transport, many of these spheres are taken by subnational state, provincial level. urban transport is specially controlled by the provinces. I think that in that sense, a crisis of this magnitude should help us to establish the roles of the national and provincial levels on different topics, especially when we talk about, for example, urban transport and the railway line. I think that the role of the federal government should be to outline the general the roadmap, and the subnational should gain, at subnational level, should gain in autonomy and capacity to take responsibility also for all these changes that we have to implement. That's the way I understand the question. I hope I understood correctly. Thank you very much, Jose. Now I'm going to take a couple more questions to round up on time. I'm going to go next with a question for John Paul. You spoke of supply and demand. What we can see is that they have mentioned the question of passenger transport, and they spoke about low demand models or demand-driven models. Do you think there is an opportunity? And I'm going to add to this question the question of multimodality. In the case of passenger transportation, we work on those topics, and there's a lot of innovation on these topics, thinking of business models in passenger transport. Do you think there's an opportunity to think of the distribution chain in a similar way to these concepts of multi-modes and demand-driven, to be able to somehow lower the impact and make distribution chain more efficient and transport to better improve business models?
Okay. In my opinion, one of the key driver in the years to come about this process for freight is going to be e-commerce. And the e-commerce firm are already establishing their own multimodal freight distribution systems with their own supply chain. They're taking control of logistics. So there, the activity, it's going to be essentially a private initiative. And we saw that in the United States, where you saw a dramatic surge in a shift in the demand, freight demand patterns, which led many sectors scramble to provide additional services for home deliveries, while commercial deliveries were plummeting. And what we realized that the Amazons of this world, for instance, were already having a multimodal national distribution type of strategy. And this process is going to reinforce and essentially their command of the distribution process. So that's, I would say, the best I can say regarding this, if any others would like to add to this process.
Muchas gracias, Jean Paul, por tu comentario.
Thank you very much, Jean Paul, for your comment. I will now ask Jose a question. The question is related to the changes in the matrix and the changes in the modality of freight transport in Argentina. The question is, what do you think are the most relevant aspects in order to address in a more rapid and efficient manner the change or the shift towards railway systems or port and fluvial transport as a way to strengthen transportation methods and leverage the opportunity that we have in front of us today?
Sí, José,
Carolina, para mí la pregunta. No. Ok, perfecto.
Sí, claro.
Bueno, sí, la implementación de esas cosas no es fácil. Yo creo
It is not easy to implement these systems. I believe that sometimes we use the terms policies, plans, this terminology we use policies and plans as interchangeable terms. And I think there is a significant difference between, first of all, having clarity in the guidelines, in the aspirations, In this sense, we're talking about a sector, such as transport sector, in a country. And then we have the plans, how to execute these aspirations. I think in Argentina, there are no clear policies. We haven't had clear policies for many years. There are efforts being made, but it is not being executed properly. I think policies have to be executed through specific plans. And I think that we have to focus on more operative issues. One of the things that was in the question, in your question, was the railways or the navigable ports. First of all, we need to define what we want. Sometimes a sector is labeled or as a service provider, and sometimes we ignore or we underestimate the environmental impacts it might have. So I think we have to put everything into the equation. There are many countries, many regions that have established policies and guidelines and then have transferred that onto specific and concrete plans. And of course, you need data, you need analysis, and you need a professional execution of these plans. I don't think we're in a good position. I started working within the state level I started working 45 years ago, and I have been very close to all the policies. And I think there is a weakness there. And I think the political aspect, not a political party in particular, but in general, in the political spectrum, they need to consider how important this is in order to develop policies, but also to really transfer this to concrete and specific plans. I think that we had a challenge before, but now we have a stronger challenge ahead of us, which is at the institutional level, with all of these institutions that must be prepared to address the challenges and the complexities of this issue. Thank you, Jose. I will ask the final question and then we will close the panel. I will ask Nestor about how we will work with the transport sector. In our country and in the region, there is a strong participation of carriers, of small carriers, SMEs, and individual carriers, even family-owned companies that have greater difficulties, as was mentioned before, greater difficulties to be able to include and adopt changes in their operation. And they might be the sector that is most affected within the transport sector as a whole by the crisis. How do you think we can involve them? How can we work with them in order to involve them in these discussions and promote a more sustainable form of transport?
Cierto que tienen unos niveles de representatividad importantes.
I think that they have chambers and federations that group them, so there can be good dialogue maybe through these associations. I think that there has to be discussions, and discussions were never interrupted. And of course, consensus needs to be attained. I think that within this strong crisis, small and medium-sized companies are suffering the highest impacts. If you have 40 trucks and personnel that you have to pay their salaries, but with no activity, they have a high chance of going bankrupt. An individual who has a vehicle and has very little work, they may have a higher possibility of surviving. So the impact of COVID on freight transport companies is very different, because within freights there are segments. There are companies working on certain types of products and which have maintained their level of activity. They have suffered no negative impact. In May of this year, for example, in Argentina, we've had practically 20% more grain export activity than last year. In ports and through other methods, this has continued. working. In other sectors, on the other hand, they've had no activity. So it's very different within the freight transport sector. It is important to engage in dialogue, but that's not much of a problem. This involves, of course, involving the carriers, but also involving those who own the cargo, the owners of the cargo. The role of the state is to ensure that transport is carried out effectively and correctly. And of course, this involves the survival of the carriers, but also the maintenance of the prices for users. So a balance has to be reached for those who provide the services.
Sigo yo, ¿no, Carolina? Sí, gracias Carolina, y yo hago eco en lo que estaba diciendo José, como siempre, y no solo lo que dijo ahorita, sino lo que mencionó antes, ¿no? Que uno, después de muchos años de estar en el gobierno, uno ve realmente, o en el gobierno, o trabajando cerca de los gobiernos, uno ve que hay avances grandes, pero que es mucho lo que nos falta, ¿no? Y en términos relativos, ¿no?
Forward, but there's also a lot of things that are still missing. I believe that governments will move slowly in certain aspects because many of the problems are further worsened because of COVID, and we need to consider more broad topics such as informality, which are there and that will not change in the short and medium term. This affects, of course, freight transport because it affects the mesh of the industrial sector. I think this is happening more and more. And as you mentioned,
hacia entender no solamente a los operadores y
understand not just the carriers and what's happening to them, but we also need to understand those who require their services. We need to understand the business mentality of the entire productive chain and the supply chains as well, in order to really bring them into the sector and involve them. Before, we only had this was just like a role within the sector, just the issue of transport. But now transport is integrated into the entire value chain, from marketing to basic production of inputs that go into any productive system, regardless of the industry. And industries themselves have merged. A manufacturing industry is not that different from a service industry. They are intertwined. And therefore, we need to understand them in combination. You cannot think of the elements in isolation. The Michael Porter model no longer applies. So I think this is something that needs to be changed. From our perspective, as the industry, we need to change our vision, which is very specialized. Of course, we need to maintain the relevance of this specialization, but understanding the workings of the capital markets of the industry A, industry Z, in order to really provide more specific solutions and engage in a more focused dialogue with private actors. I think that the sector will become professionalized, as Jose said. That is a need, and it hasn't been done enough, but it will take longer. Those of us who are already part of a professionalized service, we need to help other sectors become more professional as well. This is essential in order to engage in more effective dialogue with private actors, because they do not even know their clients well, yes, but private operators within the transport sector that work with multinationals, they don't need much help. The help is needed by the other ones. So thank you. Sorry, Carolina. It was a very important thing to say. I took a little longer than what was awarded. Thank you, Nestor, for your comment. We will close the session now because we are going a bit over the time that we had defined for the session. I would like to remind you that you can continue asking questions or use our hashtag on LinkedIn and on Twitter. Check out the hashtags here on the screen. I would also like to mention the fact that this is the first panel of a series of conferences and discussions that will continue throughout the month of July. Road freight, of course, is a topic that we will cover tomorrow. This was touched upon, of course, today, but you can continue discussing this tomorrow. Like I said, we start at 10 a.m. Argentina time, 3 p.m. Paris time. Please check that you have the time right, and hopefully you will be able to join us tomorrow as well. I would like to remind you also that we will share information, presentations, and videos on our web and on social media. I would also like to thank the panelists, our distinguished speakers today, Nestor, Gonzalo, Jean-Paul, Jose. Thank you so much for your contributions, for the fruitful dialogue. I would also like to thank the participants who joined us, everyone who connected and asked questions, etc. We believe this is extremely important in order to promote the decarbonization agenda in the transport sector. Finally, on behalf of the organizers of the International Transport Forum, the Wuppertal Institute, the Sustaintar Association, we would like to thank you for this fruitful exchange, and we hope that you can participate in tomorrow's session. Thank you.